very close to the fence on which hung a sign stating that the area was restricted and that this territory was private property and that entry was prohibited to outsiders. A tent was pitched. The people who put up this tent most likely came here to relax. They couldn't even imagine that something could happen to it. One of the guys who survived was very scared. He looked at the dead body of his friends who were lying in a pool of blood. None of them were alive. This guy looked at everything that was happening, and he understood that there was some kind of incomprehensible yellow dust around everything was in this yellow dust. The guy raised his head up and saw in front of him some huge day made of the same yellow dust. The only thing he clearly saw was the huge blade in the hands of the shadow, which was covered in blood. The guy noticed that 2 bells were tied to a red thread on the backside of the blade. The guy tried to stretch his hand forward. He screamed loudly as much as he could for help, but no one heard him. This yellow dust was approaching him very quickly. It seemed that just a little more and it would pounce on him. That's exactly what happened. Something incomprehensible grabbed his leg and held it so that he couldn't move. This force will pull him toward the forest. He was also in this yellow dust. The guy tried with all his might to hold onto the ground with his fingers. But this incomprehensible force did not react to his screams, much less to the fact that he was trying to stop it. It was pulling him further and further. After a while, his body was lying on the grass. His face was covered in blood. His eyes were slightly open, but he was dead. There were 3 people standing around the guy's body saying that they were very sorry. And why did he even go into the restricted area when one of the girls was talking on the phone? She was reporting to her boss that if there was a victim, then they would have to file a report. The second girl was saying that judging by the footprints, it should be big, and they needed to start working because they would have to stay overtime if they didn't make it in time. This girl raised her head and looked where these huge prints were inserted. 3 young people felt the presence of someone else. They understood perfectly well that it was the same creature that killed this guy. The girl didn't lose her head. She took a knife out of her pocket. She knew how to attract this creature. In her hands was a sharp knife tied with sticky tape so that she could not hurt herself with it. The girl, without thinking twice, made a cut on one of her palms so that blood spurted in all directions. She was clutching a knife that was covered in blood with the same hand that she had injured, and blood was flowing out of it onto the ground. His gaze changed at that moment and it became as if glassy. The second girl pointed her finger at some shadow in front of them and shouted to Captain Khan that it existed here. Indeed, this creature consisting of yellow was right in front of them. It was ready to attack. The other one who cut her hand looked at this creature and told the others that she would figure it out. Her eyes were fiery red. Part of her hand turned into a skeleton that held a sword. She walked straight towards this creature consisting of yellow dust that grew more and more. The girl who was going to fight this creature was from the Ministry of Environmental Protection, and she was part of a special task force to combat yellow dust. This organization had a huge office right in the center of Seoul, where many government employees also worked. There was a notice posted in the corridor that the interview room for a 9th-rank civil servant of the city of Seoul was in the next office. In the hall, there were several rows of chairs with candidates for the civil servant position sitting on them. The secretary came out and said that candidate number 12 was a young man who heard his number and answered her. The secretary told him to come in. At this time, in the public toilet that was on this floor, the young man thought that he felt as if he was about to die. He sat on the toilet with the door closed and caught himself thinking that he didn't want to go. He wanted to go home. He was very nervous. He couldn't stop shaking. It seemed to him that his heart was about to stop. His condition was on the verge of hysteria. He understood that he would definitely not cope with this interview. But despite this, he went out, approached Monica's hand, opened the tap with cold water, and decided to wash himself in order to come to his senses. He stood near this washstand for some time, trying to gather all his feelings and go to the interview. The guy looked at the water that was flowing out and caught himself thinking that nothing was helping him, even the cold water that he washed himself with. Then he took a bottle of pills out of his pocket and decided that he needed to take even more pills to calm down. He knew that he had already taken the normal amount, but he could not calm down. I don't think for long he took a few more pills, turned his head to the side. He realized that something was wrong with him. He saw a small bird outside the window that was landing on a branch. This bird seemed to be looking right at him. The guy looked at this bird without taking his eyes off it. He was inhibited at that moment. In the eyes of this bird, he saw his own reflection. It seemed very strange to him. He felt fear that engulfed his entire body. He didn't understand what to do, so he just froze. The next moment, it seemed to him that it was a bird when it turned its head and told him that he was a freak for staring at it. The guy froze near the sink. He couldn't even move. He thought he was in complete ass. When he came out of the toilet, he saw that everyone was sitting in the hall. Watching the news, the director was talking about how 4 people had gone missing during a hike on Kangwado Island. He didn't perceive this information at all because his thoughts were completely different. He walked and repeated to himself every second that he could do it and he had passed this interview. This guy's name is Maru. He is already 29 years old, but he still felt insecure. He was the most ordinary young man who lived in South Korea, and he had everything the same as other guys of his age. Like everyone else, he graduated from a simple university and tried his best to find a job. He had been preparing for the exam to become a 9th-rank civil servant for the past 5 years. Finally, despite all the obstacles, he got to the interview. The secretary girl came out and said that candidate number 35, Maru, could come in for an interview. The guy stood up from his chair and raised his hand. He said that he was here. The girl replied that the next applicant should get ready. Maru tried to convince himself that this time he would definitely pass this interview and he would pass. With confident steps, he walked towards the office where this interview was taking place. He was setting himself up for the fact that he would do it. In front of him in the office sat a man in glasses in front of a computer who was covering part of his face with his hands. Maru. When he entered the office, he felt that he was a little nervous, but decided that he would not submit the video. He kept his head raised up. The man who conducted the interview did not move and asked the guy why he decided to apply for civil service. Maru immediately answered him that he wanted to contribute to society as a civil servant. This was a phrase he had memorized. In fact, his inner self was telling him that everything was completely wrong. He wanted to join the service for the sake of stability, regular salary, and a quiet life without unexpected changes. This man, after hearing the answer, asked him another question. Then, what he would do if his boss approached him with an unethical assignment. The guy immediately replied that he would openly discuss the problem with his boss and find an acceptable solution. Of course, it is important for him to maintain flexibility at work. In fact, his inner voice told him to simply ignore this order because he did not understand how it could backfire on him. The man who conducted this interview made several notes on the guy's resume and also asked him how things were going with building interpersonal relationships. Maru started saying that he had a hard time with this. He wasn't very good at communicating, to be honest. It was a continuous stress for him. While studying at the university, his classmates whispered behind his back, discussing whether he had ADHD. In fact, he understood that he successfully established contacts with both older and younger people. The man, after hearing this answer, raised his head, removed his hands from his face, and asked the guy what he said. Let him repeat it again. The guy also quickly asked the man again, not understanding what was going on, what he wanted from him, and to himself he thought that, in fact, he had misspoke. The man covered his mouth with his fist, coughed several times, and asked the guy if he had one more question last. And then he asked this question. He was interested in what moment in his life was the most difficult and how he overcame it. The young man closed his eyes and began to talk about how he had never encountered anything like this before. But in reality, everything was completely different. Right now, this moment was happening to him. The man who was taking his exam told the guy not to worry. They just want to evaluate him and his skills in solving difficult situations. The guy raised his hand, scratched the back of his head, and said that he thought from what had come to him recently. He only remembers that as a child he went to the mountains with his father, and he started talking about it. At that moment he remembered himself as that little boy who was among the yellow dust. He didn't continue to tell anything. He thought about what happened to him then. At that moment he started having some kind of visions after when he saw this boy, he saw an incomprehensible creature that looked at him with one eye. He raised his head and looked forward, and yes, there were clearly hallucinations after taking a lot of pills. This creature, which seemed to be right in front of him, looked not with one eye, but with many eyes that were located on the shoots from his head. He remembered all this clearly when he was a little boy. He lowered his head down and remembered many bodies that were no longer moving, and that were all covered in blood. After such memories, his head started spinning, and he couldn't see anything clearly. The chair he was sitting on wobbled a little, and the guy fell over backwards, unable to keep his balance. There was no clear picture in front of his eyes. He didn't even understand what happened to him at that moment. It was as if in a fog he saw the exhaust hood that was located in the ceiling of this room. He blinked a few times and realized that the picture would stop a little bit, and he would start to see clearly. The gentleman who was taking his exam approached the young man and tried several times to bring him to his senses. He tugged at his shoulders while asking Mr. Hanmaru if he was okay. At that moment, the young man felt that he was very ill, and his head continued to spin. The young man could not hold back and threw up right on the gentleman who was interviewing him. After some time, he went to the dormitory room where he lived. The guy was lying on the bed holding a can of water in one hand, and he was thinking only one thing, that this was a complete failure. He was clenching his pillowcase with his teeth, thinking that he had just failed the interview. He was thinking that he couldn't get a job or a girlfriend, and he didn't even have any friends. He never thought that he would be able to live a normal adult life. At that moment, when he felt very bad, he felt a knock on the door of his room. When he got out of bed, he walked over and opened the door to the room, asking who was there. Imagine his surprise when he saw that there was someone there whom he did not expect to see at all. It was a huge woman who was screaming why he didn't pick up the phone. She had called him many times. The guy lowered his head down. It was his mother. He asked why she came in and why she wasn't at work now. His mother said that she came here because she brought him some food. It was really time for her to go back. The guy thought that actually food wouldn't hurt him, and did she really bring him meat? His mother said that there was no meat there. There was kimchi and stewed beans. The guy was a little upset, but still thanked her for the treat. His mother looked around this room and was a little unhappy that this room was not cleaned at all. On the table near the keyboard lay a package of soup that he had eaten a long time ago, and many other different pieces of paper and things. On the other side, there was a large number of tin cans which he drank, but did not throw away. When his mother looked at how he lives, she took a deep breath. The guy was glad that he had food. His mother asked him what kind of mess was in his room. Did he ever clean it and started cleaning up some trash? The guy told her to stop because he does it himself. His mother stopped and asked him how the interview went. The guy fell to the floor and had nothing to say. At that moment, he thought that he would never tell anyone how he threw up the face of the gentleman who was taking his exam. His mother stood and looked at him, breathing deeply, realizing that he could fail this interview this time too. Not hearing an answer but seeing the reaction the guy had, his mother told him not to despair. Next time everything will be much easier. She hit him on the back, turned around and headed for the exit. Taking an envelope out of her bag, she said that he most likely ran out of money and handed the envelope with money to him. The guy looked at this envelope. Tears and snot flowed from his eyes. He didn't want to take this envelope. He said that he was old enough to handle it and if necessary, he could get a part-time job. His mother ambiguously told him to just take the envelope while they were giving it to him. The guy didn't resist much and thanked her. Mom thought about it and said if the interview went badly, then the shaman could be right. Kanmaru asked her what she meant. She turned around and told her son that he needed to go to the mountains urgently. He stood holding the envelope she gave him in his hands, not understanding why he needed to go to the mountains. His mother was so convincing that she insisted that he return to the place where he came from. A few days later, he was on one of the piers. He stretched and looked around. The guy thought that quite a few years had passed and he didn't really want to return to these places. He stood as he had in childhood and looked at one of the mountains that was right in front of him. His mother, the last time she visited him, said that she had heard about a famous shaman, so she asked him about his job situation. This shaman told her that the reason for his problems was not ADHD or panic disorder, but something completely different. He began to climb the mountain slowly. He was walking looking around at that moment. His mother said that the shaman told her that 20 years had passed since his father left and he still hadn't returned home. And then she added that according to the shaman, his father died on the mountain they were visiting, so his spirit is blocking his path in life. He remembered her words well, that she said that this is why he needs to climb that very mountain and spill some alcohol on the ground to give him peace. Only in this way will he be able to enter the civil service. The guy was already suffocating. He did not understand how much longer he had to go. When he climbed to the very top, he found himself near the house. He caught himself thinking that he had finally found the very place where he and his father had been. Come closer to the gate. He opened it. There has been no one in this house for a long time. When he went inside and looked around, he realized that nothing had changed in this house since the last time he was here. It even seemed to him for a moment that everything returned to that very moment when he was here with his father. He was still a very small child then, and he was very happy that he and his father came to this house. He opened the gate in exactly the same way and ran inside this courtyard. Everything was like last time. The first thing he did then was run up to the door to go inside the house. He opened the door a little and looked at what was there. Then when he was little, he saw that his father was in this room and he ran to him. The father walked from one side of the room to the other, and he, being little, did not understand what was happening to him. Then he decided to run up to his father, who was standing near one wall and looking at something. The boy opened the door so that the light from the street entered the room. He stood on the threshold for some time and did not want to go inside. Something was stopping him. He clearly remembered how he, then a very small child, ran up to his father, grabbed his pants and started talking about how he was hungry, but his dad didn't hear him. His father was just breathing heavily then. He was afraid of the light and kept going into the darkness. Despite the fact that he asked him many times what he wanted to eat, his father went to the part of the room where there was darkness. sat down, and did not answer him. His eyes were glowing at that moment. Then his father stood up very strangely. Despite his son, he began to make sounds that were incomprehensible to him. These sounds were similar to the sounds of animals. Maru, when he stood on the threshold of this room, clearly remembered everything that happened on that very day when he last saw his father. The day that fell on the floor of this room, his shadow at some point showed him that it looked like the silhouette of his father. At that moment, he felt a very strong pain in his chest, and he even started coughing. The young man realized that he was suffocating and he needed to end this as quickly as possible. He took a deep breath to catch his breath, and then he took a deep breath and repeated this for several minutes until the pain left him. The young man thought that he needed to quickly finish with all this and go back down. He reached into his backpack and took out a bottle of alcohol from there. Having opened this bottle, he took out a glass and began to pour into it. After which the young man began to pour this alcohol to the sides from this glass. He said to his father, wherever he was, he hoped everything was fine with him. His mother asked him to come to this place. He also told his father that he was probably okay. He just wanted to pray to the mountain spirit just in case, and he also poured alcohol into the glass. The young man said that his father had left them quite a long time ago. You are all that is left in his glass. He said that his mother tried her best to raise him as a single person, so he asked the mountain spirit to help him find a job for her sake. He asked the mountain spirit and poured alcohol onto the ground from the glass around him. Raising his eyes, he saw some yellow dust that surrounded him. He did not understand what it was. He even thought that it was a forest fire. The guy was so upset and didn't understand what was going on that he thought he needed to get down as soon as possible before something serious happened. Safety first, he thought. He heard someone repeating his last words about safety above all else. He turned his head and did not understand whether there was really someone here, and that someone was repeating his last words. He turned his head to one side and then to the other and saw only yellow dust that was becoming larger and larger. Then he turned his head again, and then in the middle of this yellow dust he saw a silhouette resembling a man, but it was made of the same dust. This creature that was very close to him began to approach him very quickly. The guy looked, didn't understand what was happening, but couldn't take his eyes off what was happening. The only thing he saw among this yellow dust was a bamboo stick. Its end was very sharp. As this creature with a huge belly and a bloody face approached the young man, it continued to repeat safety above all else. The guy thought that he was hallucinating again, and it was all because of taking the pills. He rubbed his eyes. But when he opened them again, he realized that this was most likely not a hallucination. He was actually seeing this. This creature stood right in front of him and continued to walk. The guy became a little wary. He thought that this creature seemed sinister to him, and the first thing he decided to do was, first of all, he needed to run away from this place as quickly as possible. He turned around and started to go down. He tried to run with all his might. Well, what happened next he couldn't have imagined. He saw that very bomb, the stick that pierced him through and through, splashing in all directions. The young man knelt down and tried to pull the bamboo spear out of his body. What he thought at that moment was that he would most likely die right here on this spot and bleeding out. All his life, he had only done what he studied and worked part-time. He had never even had fun. He thought it had any significance at all. If everything ended right at this moment, then he had to worry about not being able to find a job and how he would pay off the loans. She caught herself thinking that this life is total crap. Even if he dies at this moment, no one will be upset. The only one he thought of at that moment was his mother, who worked very hard, gave him money, and thought all the time about how he would live. It was very painful for him. It was flowing from his mouth. He was thinking that he was not at all ready to die now. His body was pierced through by this bamboo spear, and he did not know how to get rid of it. He thought that it shouldn't be like this, and he didn't want to die now. It was too early for him to die. This monster came closer to him, and even closer, and showed its huge fangs. Then it opened its mouth and a very long tongue fell out. This creature was unlike anything else. As it approached, it kept repeating the same words about safety being above all else. This creature didn't even have eyes. When it came even closer to him and opened its huge mouth, he saw that inside this mouth, a green light was visible. The young man even froze when he saw this. He had never seen anything like this in his life. In fact, it was another eye of this monster that was glowing, which was standing right in front of him. He had never seen an eye in the mouth of a monster. Then the creature jumped on the young man so that he could grab it with his paws near the place where he had a wound. The young man was so upset watching everything that was happening that he started screaming for the creature to get away from him. He asked what he was or who he was, but the creature did not make any sounds. At some point, the young man even felt that he was going crazy. Everything he saw seemed unreal to him. The next moment, he felt that he really wanted to eat, just as much as he did in childhood. He also remembered his father, who sat and looked at him with completely different eyes, after which he shouted that he also wanted to eat. Everything was repeated exactly as last time. Kanmaru, his gaze became the same as his father's, and he also screamed like his father. Then, because he was very hungry, he grabbed the creature by the neck. It was unbearable to stop him. A beastly look was visible in his eyes. He was thirsty for blood. Immediately after this, blood sprayed in all directions so that it seemed like a fountain of blood. This monster with an open mouth continued to hang on the body of the young man. Its tongue was right on him. The eye that had just been bright green became almost white. It looked more like a cat's eye. The young man continued to look at this eye and saw that its color was constantly changing. It became bright green again, but some black spots appeared inside it. These black stripes were randomly located in the middle of this eye, and they were getting bigger and bigger. At one point, it even seemed that they burst out from the circle of this eye like an explosion. Then the young man saw many human bodies that were all covered in blood and had been killed. What he saw was like hell. There was no other way to explain it. Skeletons destroying each other who screamed incessantly from the pain they were experiencing. At what point did these eyes become two and they started showing him even more horrors? Somewhere very far away, he heard someone calling him, saying that he had returned. He thought that it was really someone talking to him, but he did not see anyone, so he thought that he had died. After all, he felt the taste of metal. Most likely this is the taste of death, but someone was calling him. He tried to open his eyes wider and saw two young men, one of them saying that this was a restricted area. And what was he doing here? The guy didn't understand what they wanted from him and why they were talking about some kind of forbidden zone. He tried to pester him. He was very surprised because just recently he had seen something completely different here. He began to ask these young people what they wanted from him, where the monsters were and where the yellow dust was, which had also disappeared. One of the guys asked him what he had just said, and for him to repeat again what he had seen. Hanmaru answered them that he saw yellow dust that suddenly appeared, and then a monster appeared and attacked him. At that moment, the young man remembered that he had been wounded, and the wound was quite deep and painful. The young man continued to talk about how he thought he was going to die because he was hit right in the stomach, after which he touched his stomach with his hand. The guys who found him looked at each other but didn't say anything. Everything was clear to them. These guys stepped aside a little, and the guy told the girl that when the demon detecting alarm went off yesterday, it immediately went off. He thought that it just broke. They looked at the young man and thought that this guy must have killed this demon, but they didn't understand how that could be. The girl noticed that even if this guy received the power of demon blood, it is impossible to immediately use her abilities. They also didn't understand what happened here and how much he was telling the truth. The guy approached Kanmaru, who was embroidering his sweatshirt from dirt, and addressed him. He asked the young man if he remembered what happened yesterday. Kanmaru looked at him, smiled, and asked what he didn't understand. What did he mean yesterday? Then the young man L7 his phone to see what day of the week it was, but there were no identifying marks. It was day 0, month 0, and year 0. The young man wondered if a whole day had passed. He had lost consciousness for the whole day after he had been beaten by this monster. The guy and the girl were discussing that this boy, if he was able to put up a fight against Dima, would appoint him. He had the ability, and he had survived that very day. The girl thought that it was too unexpected for him, and he still did not understand what situation he was in. The guy turned away and told her that she just needed to realize what had happened because they had all been through the same thing. The guy came up to Kanyaru and put his hand on his shoulder. He wanted to calm him down somehow and explain to him what had happened. He told him that he had arrived at just the right time and that he needed to take part in something. Kanmaru looked at the young man and asked what else he should participate in. The guy told him that he needed to change his clothes first if he had torn his. Everything that happened next was a complete surprise to him. He returned to the city. He was brought to the headquarters of the Gangwei Island Dust Rapid Response Department. They thought that the city full of love was a great place to live. He got into the Special Purpose Civil Service, or rather, to a meeting of new employees, the Special Purpose Civil Service. At this thought, he felt uneasy. He sat with the rest of the employees at this absolute meeting and did not understand how he managed to get into the civil service. He didn't understand what was going on at all because he had been going to interviews for 5 years, but couldn't get a job, and here everything was so simple. He still couldn't understand why he was suddenly attending a meeting for civil servants with the rest of them. Well, no one had given him an answer to this yet. He wanted to know why he was dragged to this meeting. He looked around at the guys who were sitting on one or the other side, and they seemed kind of strange to him. There was something wrong with their faces. All these people looked like something had happened to them. They had strange faces. The young man heard the sound of heels approaching their premises. Then he saw that they were very well groomed and had a red manicure on them. It was a very beautiful woman. She introduced herself as Yu Yan Yun, and she was the head of the Seoul headquarters, welcoming all the new employees to the meeting of the Ministry of Environment. The young man couldn't hold back. He raised his hand and he needed to get an answer to the questions he asked himself. This young man said that he does not understand and does not think that he can attend this event. This woman replied that no, she had just received a report from the Kangwado Island team and that today he had been appointed a special purpose civil servant, and she congratulated him on this appointment. The young man continued to sit with his hand raised for a few minutes, but he felt joy. He was a special purpose civil servant, but he did not understand because he had never submitted documents there. This girl told them that they probably all already knew about their unique employees from the Ministry of Environmental Protection. She continued to say that, of course, they know about what works to save lives, so it is strictly forbidden to tell their families, close friends, and whoever else about it. She also said if they spill the beans, they will be punished for violating the national security law. The young man sat with his mouth open. He did not understand what it meant to violate the national security law and how if he let it slip, it could affect one another. She continued to say that everyone present here is a new recruit who has only received demonic abilities this month. The blood of a demon enters their body. The probability of gaining a demonic ability is extremely small. The young man couldn't help himself and said that this was complete nonsense because he had never received any demon blood. Then he stopped and thought, because in fact he clearly remembers how that same monster that jumped on his hands bit him. This girl was saying that fortunately demons only appear in uninhabited mountainous areas. And when they appear at the same time, yellow dust also appears around these demons. The concentration of yellow dust is ranked from the 1st to the 10th level. She said the higher the level, the stronger the demon seems. Someone sitting next to the young man raised his hand and asked Mr. Song-woo was already here, and they answered yes. The girl said that he received the ability from a 7th level demon, and she is looking forward to his results in the future. This guy put his head down, thanked her, and said he did his best. The girl paused for a moment, looked at what else was written in her notes and what else she had to report. She said that Han Maru, who had just received power from a 1st level demon, she wanted to know what his ability was. The young man smiled, asked for forgiveness, and said that he still didn't think he knew what his ability was, and then laughed. The guy who was sitting next to him hit him on the back of the head to make him stop laughing. Han Maru didn't understand why he did that. The young Czech thought that this bastard who was sitting next to him was laughing at him now. Most likely he was laughing because he was level 7 and he was only level 1. But having gathered patience, he thought it was not important at all. He first needed to leave this strange place. He did not like it here. The alarm in this room started buzzing very loudly. The young man did not understand why and for what purpose it was necessary. The girl who was standing there said that it was just in time because, in fact, it was a warning about the appearance of a demon. At that very moment, they all came out onto the mountain path and began to climb up. She led them, showed them the way, said that this was a practical lesson. To demonstrate their abilities, they should move and climb the mountain. The young man didn't understand what the hell he was doing here yesterday. One strange thing after another was happening to him. He thought that he needed to get down from the mountain right now before it became too windy. He understood that safety was paramount. He followed everyone else, repeating the same words about safety being paramount. He couldn't stop and continued to walk forward. Yellow sand began to surround him from all sides. The young man looked from one side and then from the other. He did not understand that it was dust again around. At some point, he again reached the limit of 100, the same picture as last time he saw a silhouette in the middle of this dust. The closer he got, the more distinct the silhouette became. It was the silhouette of a girl. When he got closer and was very close, he thought that could it really be a human hand? It looked very much like a skeleton. Could it really be okay? When the girl turned and looked at him, he saw that her eyes were bright red and there was blood on her face. When he realized that something was wrong here, he stopped. It seemed to him that everything was repeating itself again, and he had already felt it. When he came closer, he saw that there was a rock in front of him, and this rock was pierced by a bloody stake. And inside this stake there was a girl. This bloody call was killed right in her head. The young man began to back away from everything he saw. He thought it was supernatural, but he didn't understand why he was brought here. The rest of the young people who were among the newcomers stood with their mouths open and watched everything that was happening. Their manager, who had just congratulated them on being accepted into government service, told them all to be very careful. Then she smiled and added that it was great and now their practical lesson should begin. She said that it is the yellow dust that surrounds them. It is only level 1. Despite its large size, it is the weakest demon. She also added that Captain Kong from the Kongwado Island team had already thrust a blade into the brain of this demon, so they could be sure that it would not move, and pointed her finger at the captain. The girl turned her head and said nothing. She needed to see all the newcomers. Looking at the young man, she wondered if this was the same guy who had killed the demon with his bare hands yesterday. She was also interested to know what kind of ability he had and how he was able to kill Diamond as soon as he received the power. Their leader said that they need to go forward using their abilities to fight the demon. The young man did not understand what she meant and what kind of battle this was, rather than her going crazy offering him to fight with someone. He came closer to this first-level creature, looked at it. He became very scared. He was worried about himself. He didn't understand what she was saying and how he could even fight this monster that was much bigger than him. The next moment, the same thing happened to him as last time. He felt a very strong pain in his chest. He decided for himself that he was having another panic attack, just like last time, and that this was a terrible chest pain. He couldn't breathe again. It seemed that his heart was working non-stop and was about to jump out of his chest. Immediately after his heart began to let go and he could already breathe, he had another desire. He wanted to eat very much. He felt hungry. This happened to him very rarely. I don't turn back. He heard someone approaching him and he felt danger. This time he was a little calmer. He silently waited for someone to come very close to him. This creature that moved on all fours and was black in color was getting closer and closer, and it came up to him and put its huge paw on his head trying to grab it. And then, holding the young man's head, it drew level with him and showed its huge fangs. This monster opened its huge mouth and began to repeat after the young man that it wanted to eat. All the guys around him stood with frozen eyes, looking, only he was writhing in pain. Saliva started coming out of his mouth and he said that he was very hungry. Then the young man raised his head up. He had a crazy look. Drool was dripping from his mouth. He screamed that he wanted to eat. His eyes this time became the same as his father's eyes. They were just white. He was holding his stomach, and drooling was running from his mouth, and it seemed like his body was changing. He tried to somehow control this situation, but he couldn't do anything. Drool was flowing from his mouth. Someone touched him on the shoulder with a finger from behind. He didn't understand who it could be, but he was very wary of what was happening to him lately. He couldn't get used to it. It was the same guy who sat next to him at the meeting of civil servants. This guy asked Han Maru if he was laughing out of fear. The young man told him that it was not like that at all. He was just a little hungry. Then he said that he did not mean that. It was all because of his pain. The guy looked down at the young man and thought, what kind of nonsense is this? He was talking nonsense. He looked like a pathetic newbie. Then he turned around and started to walk away. I understand that all the other guys, they are just all worthless. Kanmaru didn't understand what it was all about. He felt very hungry and couldn't stop this hunger. The girl climbed up one of the hills and told everyone to look at her. She then told them to let her explain the basics before they started demonstrating their abilities. She told them to look and see yellow dust around them. This dust is emitted by demons. The denser the dust, the stronger the demon. Inside the yellow dust, the monsters regenerate at an enormous speed. But that's not all. She raised her one hand and her other hand was a knife. Then she made a cut on her hand with this knife so that blood spurted out. All the young people who looked at her felt disgust at what they saw, because it was painful but to bear the wound to oneself. She showed them her hand, on which the wound was practically no longer there. She told them that they also received demonic abilities, and that is why their wounds are healed when they are in this dust. However, she said if the wound is fatal, then they could actually die, so they need to be careful. Using their abilities is possible only in the zone of dust emitted by demon. As soon as it disappears, they become ordinary people. The young man thought that this was interesting to him. He even began to call. He didn't understand how long she would continue to tell useless information. He thought he would need it, because the only thing that mattered to him was that his ability needed to be activated. The young man looked at the body of the demon that stood in front of them and wanted to activate his abilities. He looked down and said that he just needed to look. Then he bit his lower lip with his teeth until it started bleeding. The next thing he did was release the blood so that yellow sand appeared around it. He was no longer the young man who sat at the meeting of civil servants. There was a light in his eyes and he activated his abilities. He clenched his fists very tightly to get through the blood vessels in his eyes. They burst. It seemed that they were fiery red. The young man thought that this all works if someone hurts themselves and the yellow dust seeps into their blood. He decided that he should start. The first thing he did was reach into his pocket and pull out a glove. He put a glove on one hand, grabbed his finger and began to twist it. He thought of only one thing about activating his ability. The huge caul in the monster's head fell apart into many pieces. The girl who was in this group looked at this whole situation, assessed it, and realized that something was wrong here. She told everyone who was nearby to be very careful. Yellow dust covered the entire area where they were quite densely. The demon who released this yellow dust stood very close to them. He was released. This demon was so happy and started screaming. He was furious that he was chained, and on the other hand, he was furious that he could now move. This demon concentrated all his powers in his body. Now he could use these powers. He released a stream of wind. Some of the guys who were standing there started covering their faces with their hands so that they wouldn't be blown away by such a strong stream of wind. Only one of the girls decided that she knew what to do and took a few steps forward. The girl stretched her hand forward, trying to stop her. She told her to stop and not interfere, because in fact they came here for practical training. The girl in the yellow jacket said that this is too much for beginners. They won't be able to handle this monster. To which they replied that they had no time for training. If they couldn't even handle a monster of that level, they would simply die on the battlefield anyway. This monster was very slowly approaching them towards the guys who were standing below. The monster looked around to see how many victims he had, and he had already decided that he could deal with them. Among all who were below, this monster chose only one, and one was Kanmaru. The young man felt his gaze on him and asked why he was staring at him like that. The monster showed that the young man was the weakest link among all the others. He extended his hand and released a cable with a metal tip from it. In his opinion, the weapon should have killed the young man because it seemed to him that he was the weakest link. In fact, the monster was right, and he was able to wound the young man in the shoulder so that the circle splashed in all directions. The girl was very scared for him. She understood that this guy could be killed immediately. When Kanmaru was wounded, he grabbed his shoulder and started screaming loudly. After which he lifted his body a little. It was shaking all over and he was making an incomprehensible sound. The young man did not understand why he suddenly rushed at him and not at anyone else. He was trying to get away. But this monster jumped up and landed right next to him. He couldn't get away. The young man was sitting on the ground. His shoulder was covered in blood and he didn't know what to do next, and in front of him stood a huge monster. The monster came so close to the young man that he looked him straight in the eyes, and the young man looked at him. After which this monster extended its huge paw with huge claws, trying to grab the young man. At that moment, he couldn't do anything because others came to his aid. A centipede began to shoo this monster from different sides, making several loops around its neck. The noose that was around the monster's neck was getting tighter and tighter. This centipede was ready to destroy this monster at any moment. The owner of the centipede demo ability was one of the guys who came with Maru. One of the young men was approaching the monster and was ready to activate his ability. He moved at such a high speed that it was almost impossible to track him. Approaching this monster, he struck him with the force and cut off part of his head. This and another young man, his ability was the ability of the demon Hojo. The monster started screaming very loudly. Yellow sand began to surround him from all sides. He needed to recover. At that moment, the guys thought that they had defeated him and that everything had worked out for them. Well, when they stood for a few minutes and watched what was happening, they realized that this monster was recovering. His head was recovering so quickly that they didn't even imagine that it could happen. And after just a few minutes, this monster's head was in place and even his hair had grown back. One of the guys was very surprised because he thought that this couldn't be. His wounds were already healed. This monster grabbed the centipede that was killing his body with one hand, and then he threw it aside, and all his strength was completely renewed. The owner of the centipede's power did not expect that this monster would pull his centipede and thus pull his power. Then this monster struck this guy in a way that caused damage to him. The owner of the centipede power and the owner of the demonic ability Hojo were dealt a very strong blow from which they could not escape. The owner of the centipede power couldn't resist this monster. He wasn't that strong. So this monster calmly grabbed him and tried to inflict one more damage on him. For this, he brought this guy closer to himself, after which he grabbed him by the throat just as the centipede wrapped around his throat and began to squeeze him. The guy screamed that it was very painful for him and that he couldn't breathe, but he, the monster, continued to squeeze his hands. Then this monster opened its huge mouth, which was all in drool, and stretched out its disgusting tongue. The young man looked into this mouth and screamed for help. He asked to be saved. The guy who put the glove on his hand started to twist it from side to side. At that moment, the monster's neck began to spin just like this guy's glove. He couldn't hold the guy by the neck and let go of one of his hands. It seemed like someone was controlling this monster. The young man who started all this told this monster that he really thought that he would let him go that far. He was the owner of the ability of the temple demon. He began to twist his glove, and at the same time the monster's jaws turned in different directions, tearing them apart. The monster tried to leave. He also tried to stop this young man, but it was too late. The young man was so calm he brought his glove to his mouth and began to take them off. He took them off very slowly, one finger at a time, until the entire glove was removed. Then he grabbed his wrist and said that it was time for this monster to die, after which he twisted the monster's neck and his entire body around several times. He just tore off this monster's head to kill it. That was the only way he could finish it off. The body of this forest fell to the ground exhausted, and blood flowed from it. The head of this monster was on a completely different side. It was lying separately. The young man knew perfectly well that all these monsters die when they stop emitting yellow dust, so it is enough to cut their throats. The guys began to talk among themselves that this guy is the owner of a demonic ability of the 7th level, and it was impressive. This young man stood over the monster and thought that he was very sorry. This was a good chance to try new tricks. A girl in a yellow jacket approached the guy and wanted an explanation from him. The girl screamed at him that he had broken her blade in order to awaken the demon and that he was endangering the others by doing something like this without. The young man said no, it wasn't him, or she had evidence to the contrary. The girl grabbed his hand and lifted it up. She told him that if he wanted, she could try breaking his fingers again and then they would see if her blade would break. At that moment, their boss began to loudly applaud this scene that unfolded before her eyes. She said that bravo and he did very well for the first time. However, she has some comments, and these comments did not concern this young man. She said that among all the guys who came together, there was snow, and it seemed like someone was missing from them. Indeed, Kanmaru ran away, and for all the mosses he wanted to return back home. He didn't understand how he suddenly became a special-purpose civil servant and was immediately ordered to deal with the demon. He couldn't do it, and he wouldn't do it. He thought that it would be better for him to run away. Escape was his only way to salvation. When he had run a long enough distance, he stopped very abruptly. Because he raised his head up and realized that there was this yellow dust around him again, he didn't understand what was wrong now. The girl who brought them to this place looked around. She realized that he had seriously fled when he encountered the demon. He was not fit to be a special-purpose civil servant. The second girl thought about it because she needed to understand everything, because not everything was so clear. She wanted to answer the question for herself that it was the first time and how he was able to deal with the demon. She tried to reconstruct the events that happened and that this monster threatened only him. She understood that it was not her imagination that this monster was aiming only at one newcomer. The girl in red said that the inspector should find the newbie. Her employee replied that it was very strange. After all, the monster was actually dead and the yellow dust was still here. This shouldn't be happening. The girl in red, when she heard about this, she thought that really, what is this? Kanmaru stopped because in front of him he saw a huge gate and a very bright light was coming from it. He did not understand where the gate came from. It seemed that behind these gates there was something very brightly reminiscent of the sun or fire. He was very scared because another young man, a monster, came out of these gates and decided to hide. He tried to keep from screaming in fear, covering his mouth with his hand when this monster passed through these gates. The young man swore and did not understand because he finally escaped, but for some reason, he again encounters one of these monsters. He tried to sit as quietly as possible so that no one would notice him, and most importantly, so that this monster wouldn't notice him. After a while, he looked out and looked at the road. Not seeing anyone, he thought that this monster had disappeared. He looked further but saw no one. The young man thought that he had already left, but this monster was behind him. One of the guys called the captain. He needed to tell them something. This guy was shouting very loudly to Captain Kang Chaga. He was calling him to come over. The young man ran up to the captain. He couldn't say anything because he was very out of breath. The captain asked him what happened. This guy's name was Yeseok. He said that the office called and announced a third-level demon alert. The girl in red started screaming that this couldn't be happening because monsters had never appeared in the same zone at the same time before. The captain started screaming because she needed to know where this monster was. There was a sign on the fence that said this was a restricted area, private property, and entry was prohibited to outsiders. He grabbed this sign and raised it up so that he could slip under the wire on which this sign was hanging. He ran away very quickly, so it seemed that nothing could stop him. The young man ran very quickly on his shoulder. It was early, and he thought only about one thing: how to get out of here. He didn't want to stay in this place because the events that were happening to him didn't please him at all. He was so scared that he screamed for someone to help him. He asked for salvation. We just ran so fast that he didn't pay any attention to his feet, and that's why he tripped over a stone that was lying on the ground. After a few seconds, he fell to the ground, stretched out his hand forward. He did not understand why all this was happening to him. When he was getting up, he thought that it was all for a reason. He looked around and saw yellow dust again. Raising his eyes, he saw that in front of him there was a small house and clothes hanging on a rope. The young man thought that he could hide in this house. He just needed to run to it. He ran closer and decided that he needed to hide in the first room he came across where the doors would be open. Once inside, he decided that he could rest for a few minutes. Coming back to the door, he wanted to see if this monster that appeared behind him started chasing him. Well, right there, he saw that among this yellow dust, there was that very monster. Then the young man did not understand why this was happening and why he was really pursuing only him. When he saw this monster again, he noticed that it had no eyes at all. He thought that if he could find it anyway, then it was the end for him. He was interested in the leaves that were above the head of this monster and why it suddenly appeared where it was, and at that moment he heard some strange creaking sound and saw the gate opening. A very old man was approaching him. He was holding a bowl in his hands. This man asked who was there. Then she took a few steps and he asked where the yellow fog came from in broad daylight. He couldn't see anything in it. This old man was saying that it was very foggy and that he couldn't see anything. The monster understood that if he couldn't see anything, then he wouldn't be able to see him either. The young man thought that this old man was in danger. He had to help him anyway. But on the other hand, the young man was proud of himself for thinking that he had no abilities at all. He thought that he could do. He remembered the words of that same girl who said that they also received demonic abilities, and that is why their wounds are healed when they are in the yellow dust. He realized that this is what he needs. But on the other hand, he crossed his fingers and thought that he couldn't die. Wouldn't it be better for him to hide and not risk his life to save some stranger? He, as always, repeated the same words about safety being above all else, and that he absolutely must survive. This old man didn't see anything, so he tried to ask who was there. He thought that Mama Cheng Shik was there. The monster that was very close to this old man continued to repeat his last words. Mama Shan Shika. The old man realized that he was being teased and took a few steps and said that it was enough to tease him. He narrowed his eyes and did not believe what he saw. The old man even became scared. In front of him was a terrible monster with closed eyes. It was simply enormous. The old man staggered and fell back. He was so scared that he wanted to understand what it was and how it ended up here. This monster kept saying the same words that old man Mama Changshik said. Then this huge monster raised its index finger with long claws upwards. And then he lowered it down and all the leaves that were above his head turned into sharp peaks that he was ready to send towards the old man. After which he pointed his index finger in the direction and sent these peaks in his direction. The old man was so scared that he closed his eyes and sat like that for a while. Then he realized that nothing had happened to him. He needed to open one eye and understand what was going on. Before his eyes, he saw a young man whose shoulder was covered in blood. This young man asked the old man if he was okay and how he was feeling. The old man raised his head, looked at the boy, and said that he was fine, but he was a little scared by the blood on the boy's hand. That's why the old man told him that his shoulder was all in blood. At that moment, the young man fell right on this old man, and his back were all the spikes that the monster had released. The young man told the old man to run away from that place as quickly as possible. When he felt some pain, the young man thought why he only had first-level abilities. He was a little upset because his ability was as worthless as his resume. He was missing one arm. He believed that the resume plays the biggest role in everything. He thought that in the end, he would simply die because he was so weak that he could not even save the old man. This old man did not run away and did not listen to the young man. He thought about what to do, but he did not stop being afraid. The young man thought that he did not want to die. He dreamed that someone much more experienced with better abilities than he had would come, and he thought about it and begged that someone would come to him. It seemed to him that this was the only way he could be saved. He sat on the ground and couldn't do anything about it. The same yellow sand that surrounded him began to disperse from his wound where his hand had been. This yellow sand seemed to penetrate his entire body, and it moved through all the vessels on his neck and face. At that moment, the young man lowered his head down. It seemed to him that this was his last minute. Then he exhaled the same yellow sand that monsters surround themselves with. Then he opened his mouth and drool started flowing out of it. He wanted to eat again. The young man's eyes changed again, and he looked more like a demon with abilities. So the next thing he did was he jumped up and pounced on Diamond, who was chasing him. At that moment, the captain was trying to find the young man. She had to understand why the monster was chasing him. She moved very quickly on his tracks and thought that she would be able to catch up with him before another monster attacked him. In just a few minutes, she was near the very house in which the young man was trying to find shelter. She realized that he was somewhere there, so she ran to the gate and quickly opened it to go inside. Imagine her surprise when she saw what was happening there. She saw how this young man jumped on this monster and bit him on the neck, tearing him to pieces. The captain looked at the young man and understood that this was the same newcomer, but she did not understand what he was doing. The monster tried to throw the young man off so that he wouldn't bite off his head. To do this, he tried to throw it aside as far as possible. Despite the fact that the young man couldn't hold on to his body and was indeed thrown aside, he wasn't going to stop there. He continued to look at this monster with the same look when he shows his demonic abilities. The monster at this moment was trying to recover so that he could continue to fight the young man, but he couldn't do anything. He turned around and went back. The captain noticed that the demon couldn't heal the newbie's bite and he was bleeding. She didn't understand why this was happening and how this could be. The captain caught herself thinking that now was not the time to think about this topic. She went after this monster. She believed that she needed to deliver a fatal blow to this monster to finish him off. When she got as close to him as possible, she tried to grab him by the head, but she couldn't do it, so she grabbed the pike on his head. When she grabbed it, she understood that she needed to hold this pike in her hands now. The pike was so sharp that she was squeezing it so tightly in her hands that blood spurted out. The captain was the owner of the Iron Demon ability, and she took out her huge sword. When she took one of the peaks from the monster, he stopped seeing the ordinary image. So from that moment on, he saw everything in bright colors and with certain shades. He saw the captain not in a yellow jacket, but in a bright crimson jacket. Everything changed greatly in his vision. The captain prepared to deliver the fatal blow to this monster. She only needed to finish the job that had been started. The captain swung and hit the monster with all her might, so that he could not escape the blow. Blood spurted in all directions. Despite this monster has put up a defense, trying to somehow save himself and not be killed. But the captain was confident in her abilities, so after the first blow she struck again, she was a professional in this matter. She just needed precision and to hit the head of this monster. What she did, she divided the head of this monster exactly in half down the center into two parts. The very next moment, the head, divided into two parts, began to fall in different directions. The captain landed on the ground holding her sword in one hand. She not only broke this monster's head in half, she broke his entire body, so everything around was covered in blood. The captain watched as this monster simply split into two parts and turned into sand. The captain noticed that an old man was lying on the ground not far away, and she decided to approach him. When she came up, she asked him if he was okay. The old man was lying with his eyes closed. Then he very slowly began to open his eyes. The girl realized that he had most likely come to his senses. Then this old man stopped, shook his head and asked what just happened. He doesn't remember anything. The girl smiled at him and said that nothing like that had happened. A wild boar had just appeared, but had already run away. The girl knew that fortunately, ordinary people forget about demons as soon as the yellow dust disappears. So the old man told her another wild boar is continuing to ruin his birth. The girl told the old man not to worry. As a civil servant, they would take on the elimination of the consequences themselves. The old man ran to his house. He was happy and thanked them. The girl earned money and told the old man to take care of himself. She looked from one side, not seeing anyone, turned her head to the other side. She wanted to find a young man. Taking a few steps forward, she saw him sitting to the side. She came closer to him and said, "What about this newcomer?" and then added that she had never seen such amazing regeneration before. In fact, his severed arm had already grown back and it was still there. She asked him if he really was the owner of only a first-level demon ability. Kanmaru screamed in despair. He was afraid of what he had experienced recently. He received a text message on his phone saying that he had to start work tomorrow as a special duty officer at the Yellow Dust Control Bureau. They asked him to go to work, but he couldn't forget that demon that he chose him out of all of them and tried to attack him. He stood before his eyes from the moment that demon was chained and stood motionless. He couldn't come to his senses after the demon launched a sharp weapon at him that pierced him right through. The young man sat on his bed and tried to get rid of all these memories of his last day. He knew for sure that he didn't want to go to this job anymore. He thought that he had not yet recovered from the shock, so he lay down on his bed and thought that he was not going anywhere. On the other hand, he lay there and thought that he really needed a job. He had been trying to become a civil servant for a long time, but he couldn't do it. At some point, he even thought that maybe he should try again and maybe this job isn't so scary. The young man turned on his side, covered himself with a blanket, and thought that the morning is wiser than the evening. After a while, he fell asleep very quickly, but his dream was as if it were real. It seemed to him that he was being transferred from the room in which he was located to a place where there was no one and complete emptiness. Then he saw the same picture that he saw with the first demon when he encountered him. It was a horrible picture reminiscent of hell where many monsters were trying to get out of there and who were screaming at him to come back louder and louder. Kanmaru began to breathe heavily. His body was covered in sweat. He suddenly opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. Then the young man stood up, sat on the bed, and took a few breaths in and out to calm himself down. He didn't understand why he dreamed about it again. It already seemed like it was haunting him, the meeting of newcomers. At first he thought that these nightmares were keeping him awake. He looked out the window and realized that it was already morning. Then the young man came up and looked out. It was actually already morning, or it was unclear whether it was the light that was emitted somewhere very close. When the young man looked at what was happening on the street, he saw that these were not the rays of dawn. It was something else. He didn't understand what it was. It looked more like there was a fire on Mount Chong, but he understood that it couldn't be, and how could the fire spread so quickly? At this time on Mount Chonga, in the middle of the night, a demon with fire powers burned everything around him. This demon seemed to be very angry and lived together, he growled very loudly. 2 employees of the Special Purpose State Service, the Bureau for Combating Yellow Dust, arrived to calm this demon down. One of these special agents had the ability of a water demon. She could release raindrops from her entire body. She directed raindrops at this demon to cool him down and put out the fire in his body and everything that was burning around him. Her partner took a deep breath and exhaled deeply to activate his abilities. Her partner was the owner of the ability of the ice demon, and instead of water, he released ice drops or ice arrows. When these ice arrows touched the monster, that part of the monster turned into an ordinary block of ice. In this way, he was able to completely freeze this monster and place it in a huge block of ice. The girl asked the captain because in fact demons shouldn't appear at night, then it's unclear why he appeared. The captain replied that she just needed to focus on preventing the fire he had started on the mountain. Despite the fact that the ice block was quite huge, it began to melt and evaporate under the power of the monster inside. A huge ice hook appeared in the captain's hands, from which an ice chain came. The captain said that he would take care of the demon himself. She should worry about the fire. Then the captain pushed off and moved forward to attack this demon that had started a fire on the mountain during the night. The next moment, an incomprehensible force broke through the ice block and reached the brain of this demon. It was that same black force with huge green eyes that ordered the demon to bring him to him. The next moment, this demon seemed to feel a surge of power and began to burn again, so that he was able to break the ice fragments around him. He freed his entire body from this ice block, so that the fragments flew in different directions. The captain approached the demon in order to destroy it with his ice weapon, but the monster had a huge fire fist. This monster swung its huge fire fist to strike the captain. The demon took a step forward and struck the captain. Did not have time to dodge this blow. He only put up a defense and took this blow on himself. The impact was strong enough that the captain flew off and hit the trunk of a tree. The captain felt a wild pain from this blow on his face, and he also looked at his burnt hands. His partner shouted that she was ready to help the captain, but she didn't know what to do. The fire was consuming more and more, and this fire was coming from this demon. It seemed that his powers were increasing. The demon was becoming much bigger and stronger, destroying everything around him. The captain did not understand why this was happening and why this demon was becoming stronger. They stood together and watched as this demon grew in size, becoming stronger and stronger. At the same time, no one was sleeping at Seoul headquarters. Everyone was on alert. Everyone who was involved in this issue and was at headquarters did not understand what was happening. The head of headquarters was trying to understand what the current state of affairs was and what to expect next. All the graphs were displayed on the screen. They were all red, and this indicated both dangers. The map, which was also displayed on the screen, showed many icons of dangerous zones at the moment. The female operator said that they were being attacked simultaneously on 20 mountains across the country. She also tried to report that the demon's behavior pattern had completely changed. The head was furious. She didn't understand how this could be. Demons had never appeared in the same zone at the same time before. She caught herself thinking that this had all started a week ago during the newcomers' meeting. Now she needed to understand why. One of the operators turned around and reported to the head that there was an urgent call from the branch in Busan. The head walked up to the control panel, pressed a button, and said that Seoul headquarters was in touch. She asked what had happened. On the other hand, she heard only 2 words. God, sister, it's obvious that there were troubles there too. A male voice said that the head of the Busan branch, Bae Myung-shuk, was speaking. He said that he hoped that everything was fine with them and asked when she would come to visit. The head told him to leave these childish games and get down to business. She was very concerned. Then Bae Myung told her that they had problems on Mount Gyeongbyeong in Busan. He tried to explain to her that the portal had been open for 3 days in a row, and no one could do anything about it. The head, when she heard these words, was very upset. She shouted to him, "Is he still open?" Pemong answered her that they have been killing and killing demons coming out of this portal for 3 years now. But despite this, they still continue to crawl out of this portal. They can't close it. And then he added that the Kumjong mountain team was completely exhausted and he had no more people. She asked him why the portal didn't close and whether they had found out the reason why it happened. In fact, they were trying to destroy them and did not understand why the portal did not close. And the demons that flew out of this portal making sounds are not salting some nonsense. Moreover, absolutely all the demons said approximately the same thing. According to the translator of the Busan branch, all the demons said the same thing. The translator said that these demons demanded that they bring him to them. The head was even more shocked. She didn't understand what it meant to bring and who needed to be brought. At that moment, a demon flew out of this portal, which looked like a ballerina. He also moved gracefully like all ballerinas. This demon ballerina jumped forward and began to move. It seemed as if he was dancing some kind of dance. This demon made a jump, and just like the ballerina landed on the tip of his limb. P-Men answered that they need to bring someone, and where they need to bring them. He said that in any case he still has to show up. The Secret Service officers watched the graceful dance of the demon, thinking only about one thing: how to destroy him. The head disconnected from the conversation. She needed to think about why all this happened and who was the cause of it. She thought about it and understood only one thing: that it all happened at the moment when the meeting of newcomers was taking place, which means it was one of the newcomers. A helicopter was flying in the sky above the mountains, which was supposed to observe and help in a critical situation. The young man who was sitting in this helicopter received a call. He picked up the phone and asked what happened. He was told that the situation was a grief. Chamjong was hard. The young man said that everything was clear to him. Then he got out of the helicopter's cockpit and said that he was almost there. At the very end of the conversation, he said that he would call back when he was finished and could sort everything out. The next thing he did was he jumped from that helicopter down to the ground. The young man was very quickly approaching the very place where this portal was located. When he was flying almost to the top of this mountain where this portal was opened, he slowed down. It seemed that he was hanging in the air very close to the place where he was going. Yellow dust began to gather around him, which meant only one thing: that there were demons nearby. He, like everyone else with demonic abilities, could absorb this dust. He needed this in order to activate his main demonic abilities. He stopped and froze between that very place in the sky. It was a spatial inversion. He very slowly began to descend to understand what had happened and why the situation was so critical. Having landed on the roof of the gate, or, as in this situation of the portal, he saw that it was really open, so he went to the very edge. He stood at the very top of this portal, and all he had to do was understand why this happened and what needed to be done to close it. One of the civil servants turned her head and asked the others who was there. The others also looked and did not understand where this guy came from. The girl shouted to him so that he could hear that it was very dangerous to be here. She wanted to warn him. Her words were heard by a demon who looked like a ballerina and who was constantly dancing. He seemed to be happy that he would be able to engage in battle with someone. He approached the girl from behind, jumped high and tried to hit her. This demon wanted to stab her in the back with his limb. The girl saw this demon and was a little scared. She didn't know how to behave with him. The demon was very fast, and he struck her from behind in the back so that she fell to the ground face down. The girl raised her head and looked back. She did not hear how he approached her from behind. This monster was very close to her and was about to strike again with its limb. The young man who was on the roof of the open portal began to push the space apart with his hands. First, he made a small hole, and then he started to enlarge it so that the hole became bigger and bigger. When this space became large enough and the gap in this space increased, then he was able to reach that very monster that was constantly dancing and that wanted to hit the girl. It was a spatial rift. The young man stuck his hand into this spatial gap to get this monster, and then he made a sharp jerk back around him. There was quite a lot of blood splashes flying in different directions. In the hands of the young man was the skeleton of the very same monster that had threatened one of the special agents a few seconds ago. He tore the skeleton out of the monster's body using a spatial rupture. All the other civil servants who were below stood with their mouths open. When this young man jumped down to them, he said that they had all worked hard and they were already very tired. He took a few steps forward and told them that he would sort things out himself so that they could go and rest. One of the civil servants even burst into tears, and the girl asked the captain who this guy was. The captain turned around and told the girl that she was still a newbie, so she didn't know anything about this guy yet. In fact, it is the first demonic ability owner who founded the Yellow Dust Fighting Group, and he wanted to say something else but looked at the young man and said that it was time for them to wrap up, and then added that this was the strongest owner of the demonic ability, the head of Young Il-du. When all the other employees left, Chung-il put his hands on the ground and began to prepare to close this portal. He scratched many paths on the ground with his hands. They resembled energy flows. If they were closer, it would be offensive how his energy force moves very quickly through them. Then these small streams all came together and rose upwards. These energy flows surrounded the open portal from which monsters had been emerging for the last 3 days. The remaining civil servants who had moved aside to a safe distance could observe what was happening, but only from the sidelines. The girl raised her head up and asked what those black gaps were that she saw in the sky. Her captain replied that this was the first time he had seen them at such a close distance. He had heard of someone with spatial ability, but had never seen them. And no one could answer why this guy is considered the strongest. Song Il-du made another spatial rift to see where else there were problems. When he made this spatial gap, yellow dust appeared in this space. At the same time, in another part of Mount Cheongye in Seoul, the fire did not stop. It seemed like it was getting even bigger and taking over even more territory. She said that everything was on fire. The demon who possessed the power of fire poured water all around him, despite the fact that they tried to stop him with ice and water. But this did not affect him in any way. At some point, the captain felt that his hand began to hurt very badly, and it no longer had the same strength. His partner was lying wounded on the ground. He thought that they were probably finished. At this point, he told his partner to pull herself together because they needed to run urgently. Otherwise, they couldn't die. The monster was getting closer and closer to them, and it was unbearable to hold it with the ice. The captain thought that the only thing he could do in this case was create an ice wall that could hold him back for a while they were running away. He stretched out his 2 hands forward and tried to stop him with this ice wall. Well, the monster was so strong that he was able to break this ice wall in front of him with the help of his 2 fists. The captain understood that the fire was getting closer and closer, and he could not hold back not only the fire but also this monster. He tried several more times to put an ice shield in front of himself, as a shield that would withstand the blows of this monster. But this ice shield crumbled into small ice fragments with each blow of the monster. The monster pierced this ice shield with its blow, breaking it into small ice fragments. After another blow, the captain could not hold this monster and was hit and flew to the side. The captain understood that his affairs were very bad, so he thought about how to proceed. At some point, the captain even thought that it was his death. The monster was very close to him. The captain turned his head, first closed his eyes thinking that this was the end, then he opened one eye. I don't understand what's happening. He saw that there was a spatial rupture behind this monster, and there was someone behind this monster. Then everything happened very quickly. Song Il-du's hand grabbed the fire monster's head from behind. Then his hand suddenly turned the monster's head to face him so that he could see its fiery mouth. The young man then threw the fire monster back quite a distance. The black stripes in the sky continued to glow, and a very loud sound could be heard. The demon who watered everything around this mountain felt strong and did not yet understand that this was his end. The young man looked at this fiery monster and turned his head one way and then the other. He stretched out his hand forward and said that it was time for him to clean up here too. Everything was in a very deplorable state. When he put his hand forward, he began to turn from one side to the other around himself. He activated the mass activation function of the brakes he had made up to this time. At this very time, in Gangwon Province, on Mount Seorak, one of the monsters tried to attack an employee of a state special service institution. He managed to catch up with this employee and throw him to the ground and then hold him with his lower limb. All this monster had to do was to approach with his claws and devour this special government employee. The young man lying on the ground thought that this was his end. He turned his head and closed his eyes so as not to look death in the face. At that moment in that place, a rupture occurred. That space was exactly in the place where that monster was located. And already in the next moment, this gap was so big, and it was behind this monster, that this gap began to absorb this monster inside. Prove exactly the same situation happened in another part of Gwangju on Mount Mudeong. The gap also swallowed one of the demons. The frightened civil servants did not understand what was happening, and they silently watched everything that was happening. On Jeju Island on Mount Hala, a rift in space made by a young man sucked in a demon, and the frightened civil servants did not understand what it was. Almost every place where demons were released, there were ruptures in space and they were pulled back inside. All the demons that were released over the course of 3 days were cleared, and through a rupture in space were placed in one place. The rifts in space began to shrink and narrow as the number of demons inside increased. After some time, the gaps in space became very minimal, which indicated that almost all the demons were inside. One of the operators turned around and reported to the chief that the yellow dust had suddenly disappeared in all zones except Busan. The head smiled and said, "That's very good. It means everything is going according to plan. He arrived safely." Song Il-do looked around. The most important thing for him was that they were all gathered in one place. Indeed, the young man stood in the middle, and around him were the demons that he had gathered with the help of the rupture of space. He raised his head and said that it looked like they were all gathered in this one place. Then the young man smiled and asked these demons if they agreed. Then it was time to start. Monsters from all sides tried to attack him. It seemed to them that they could deal with him alone very easily. So they started to approach the young man in the center from all sides. There were a lot of them, and they were all approaching him to destroy him. They tried to attack from all sides in order to attack him. He stood calmly in the very center. Raising his hand up, he pointed his index finger into space when these monsters were very close. Then he moved this hand to the side and made a spatial gap, and a black stripe appeared again. This spatial rift was passed through several demons that came very close to it. Or rather, through all those who surrounded him from all sides, he made a spatial rupture throughout the entire circle around himself. He destroyed all these monsters that were approaching him by cutting off their heads. This was the only way to kill these monsters. Fountains of blood gushed into the sky. The other employees who were watching him work from the side were so surprised that they could only open the door. The girl looked at the young man and his work. She did not understand what it was. She had never seen such power before. One of the demons was a fire demon. He cut off his arm and part of his body. He approached this demon. I looked into his eyes. He needed to know the reason for such an appearance lately. He called a girl translator so that she would translate to this demon everything that he would say now, and so that she would translate the demon's answer. Song Il-do took Dima's head with his hand. She raised it up and held it like that for a while. Then he asked this Vadim what was the reason for his frequent appearances over the past week. The girl translator continued to say the same thing that they brought him to him. Song Il-do didn't understand what was being discussed and didn't understand who they were asking to bring. The fire demon continued to speak to the question of who he answered and so on several times. The girl translator said that the demon either really asked for someone to be brought or simply repeats a phrase he heard somewhere. At that moment, the young man threw the fiery demon aside and said that then they had no choice. And if these demons continue to crawl out through this portal, then they simply need to destroy them all. They have no other choice. The young man's face after this battle was covered with several scratches on his face from which blood was flowing. He was a little upset by this answer, wiped the blood from his face and turned around and told everyone else that it was time. He looked at the gate and realized that now it was time to deal with the door that was letting these demons out. The young man sat down again, lowered his hand, and placed it on the ground. With the help of his power, a bright glow began to shine around his hand. This indicated that he was transmitting his power through the earth. He made a gap from his hand to the very gates that released the demons. This gap in space became larger and larger, and it was visible how it was absorbing these gates. He didn't just absorb these gates, he destroyed them. After a while, there was nothing left in that place. The civil servants who watched him work could not contain their emotions. They thought that this was an amazing girl who said that it was nice to realize that such a person was in charge. One of the civil servants said that this young man was about 50 years old, but he looked his age. He was actually much younger. When he had absorbed everything through the gap in space, he closed the gap and removed his hand from the ground. They stood and looked at the very place where the portal gates had just been opened and understood that these gates, the portal itself, had disappeared. Most likely, maybe it was because of the spatial abilities of the young man, thought about the rest of the civil servants. The next morning, everything was basically as usual in the office in Seoul. The head of Song Il-do's office entered and asked the young man if he had already arrived. She was only interested in one question: what did he do with the gate? The young man straightened his tie and said that for now he had placed this gate in his space of darkness. The head said that this is even worse than death. The young man lay down, closed his eyes and said that he was very tired. And then he added to her that she was again being very dramatic. There was not a single red spot on the scoreboard. The head said to the young man, "Isn't his ability alone enough to deal with all these demons? Because it has always been like this." The young man answered her that he has his limits when he acts alone, and that managing their organization is very exhausting for him. The head said that she was not going to argue with him, but they needed to get back to business and showed the information he asked for. At that moment, she pressed the button on the remote control and photographs of the newcomers appeared on the TV screen. The head asked where the young man's sudden interest in their new employees came from. The young man looked at each of them attentively. Then he raised his head and looked at her, and said that he wanted to understand which of all these newbies the demon was looking for. Before his eyes were dozens of newcomers who had recently entered their civil service. Among all these newcomers, there was only one who was different in appearance from all the others. He was also different in his look. The young man wondered why they needed him. The many demons on the other side looked at only one. They looked at their deity. It was like a female body that was there and that was producing all these demons. This female body with a female head was in the very center, and all the other demons guarded and surrounded her. She was much more than all the others. She was their deity. It was she who had the fiery green eyes that Kanmaru saw, and it was she who demanded that he be brought to her. She needed him. The next morning, there were no people at the headquarters of the Manhwa Island Dust Rapid Response Department. The only one who came so early was Kanmaru. He finally decided to go to civil service. He stood in front of the headquarters entrance and thought that he had finally ended up here. His mother even cried when she found out that her son got a job in the government. She cried with happiness because she no longer hoped that this would ever happen. And he couldn't do anything because she was so happy that he got the job well. He thought about how maybe someone like that wouldn't really succeed at this job. When he went inside, he saw a young man dressed in a bright green shirt who was not at all happy to see him. This guy passed by Hanmaru and said that he doesn't understand what he forgot here because he doesn't need pissers at all. Hanmaru covered his nose because and knew this strong guy smelled of alcohol. This guy went further down the corridor and saw someone else and said, "Did he really come too?" This guy in a shirt and shorts was the head of the department. A young man standing at the end of the corridor asked him why he was being sent to Carwado instead of Seoul headquarters. The head of this headquarters answered him that he did not know why they were sending a 7th level ability owner here, and then he added that maybe something was wrong with him. He said maybe this guy's a criminal or something like that anyway. He told him welcome to the Gangwado team. The young man stopped, watched everything that was happening, and thought about what he would do at this job. The young man saw a crack at the end of the corridor. It was a door slightly open, and a bright red light was coming from it. He was a little scared because he imagined what could be behind that door. He thought that there was a huge table on which monsters were lying, and all the other agents were trying to conduct experiments on them. It seemed to him that everything there should be covered in blood. Since he had been having so many bloodthirsty dreams lately, he thought that something similar would happen here too. The young man stopped and could not take a step forward. Someone called him by name. It was the head of this branch. He told the young man why he was standing there and told him to come in or he was going to work in the hallway. When they entered the room, there were many workstations and some of them were already occupied. Kanmaru tilted his head and thought when he saw everything around him that he had not expected this at all. The head of this branch said that first of all he should introduce himself. His name is Go Dokman and he is the head of the Gangwa Island branch. Then he showed a girl who was sitting already working. He said that this was Agent Yoon Ji-won. She already had 7 years of service. Then he was introduced to Agent Kim I-pak. He also had 7 years of service. This guy grew a tree at work. On the other side sat Agent Nam Ye-suk. She had worked the least amount of time in the civil service. She had only 1 year of work in this service. Then the chief said that now they can go because they know what they need to do next, the guys thought. Does he really not want to tell them anything? Each of them went to their desk, and Hanmaru thought that this was his first time here. Were there really no instructions on what he was supposed to do at all? Right opposite him sat another newbie. A young man looked at him, and this guy was also unhappy. Apparently, he was also worried about his first day at work, just like Hanmaru. The young man thought that it was good that he had a comrade in misfortune. At least he wouldn't be so lonely. At that moment, he thought that they needed to get along. He felt very awkward, but he asked how the guy was doing. The young man turned his head to the side. He had no intention of talking or communicating with Hanmaru. These words really hurt the young man. You could see how his teeth clenched and he squeezed out what he was staring at him. At this point, Hanmaru would have liked to make a note in his diary. He would have written that his colleague had gone crazy. The guy who came with him lowered his head down and started to wail that he simply couldn't believe it. And it was simply ridiculous that such an elite like him was sent to the Conquado team. The young man didn't understand what the problem was and what was wrong with this team. Kanmaru then decided to turn to the agent sitting next to him. He asked him for forgiveness. He wanted to ask something, but he saw that this agent was looking at things in some online store. He asked what he needed. The young man wanted to know what the Conquado team was like. Nam Ye-seok thought a little when he heard this question because he didn't know how to explain it correctly. Then he pointed his finger and started saying that their department was quick to respond to yellow dust. He showed that this department has 30 headquarters in Seoul, Gyeonggi-do, Busan, and other cities in the area of one headquarters. Different teams are responsible for each mountain. Those who have the 7th level of ability and above are assigned to the headquarters and are sent only on very important missions. On the other hand, the so-called Hanjik zones, where the population is low and demons appear only occasionally and even then at a weak level, are one of these zones, Gangwado. The agent continued to talk about how all the incompetent and damaged people are sent to such places. The young man was very upset because he certainly didn't want to hear that he was inferior, and that was why he was here. But he didn't understand then what was wrong with everyone else who was in that room. She continued to talk about how, however, there are many very capable people who came here voluntarily. The young man asked her who would do that. The agent turned her head and looked forward. At that moment, a girl with long black hair entered the room where they were working. She was very beautiful. As soon as Kanmaru saw this girl, he was even glad that he would work with her. The girl wiped her wet hair with a towel to dry it faster. One of the agents told Captain Kang Chana to go home immediately after work. The girl fixed her hair and said that she had nothing to do anyway, so she would stay at work. Captain Sila to his workplace, it was just that one opposite Namye Seok culture told about their team. The captain at that moment saw that this suspicious knight was assigned to their team. She was a little surprised. She thought that it was very strange that he woke up then without a single memory of what happened. Kanmaru, after his neighbor started calling him himself, and he really wanted to sleep. He was also interested to ask if he would receive a bonus if he worked in their team. The agent shook his head. Then the young man realized that he would still have to risk his life and fight the demon. The agent opened one eye and said that he should know that the premium was about 5 and the treasure. When the young man heard such a sum of money, he couldn't even imagine that he could earn so much. For him, it was like he unexpectedly won 5 salaries in a casino. For him, it was a whole lot of money. His neighbor said that this is exactly how it is, but that was all, and said that it was enough to distract him. He put his headphones on his head and said that the young man should wait until the alarm sounded. Kanmaru didn't understand if he could distract him with something, since he asked him very few questions. Then he decided that he had no choice but to simply wait for the alarm to go off. He was sitting in his fucking place. He had time to go out for a break. He looked at his watch and his work time was almost up. After drinking a cup of coffee, he thought that he really liked working and that this work brought him pleasure. And the most important thing is that he also had a huge salary. It was simply his dream job. The head of this headquarters stood up from his workplace and stretched. Then he looked at the time and the alarm and said that it was time for them to wrap up. After which he approached the young man and asked him how he was, as a newbie, how his first day at work was going. He smiled and asked if he had any questions during his work. The guy who came with him said that he had no questions and everything was clear to him. Kanmaru was not like that, and he said that something was bothering him and he wanted to clarify it. A young man asked his boss who demons are and where they come from. The head of the headquarters said that he himself did not know for sure. He tried to make a very smart appearance. The agent who was sitting next to the young man said that demons are just creatures that come from above. Isn't that obvious? Kanmaru thought that it was very creepy. Monsters appear out of nowhere and kill people, and they are not even curious. Maybe humanity is really doomed. The head of the headquarters laughed and said that this was all very sad, of course. At that moment, the young man thought that he didn't even know about the existence of demons and everything was fine with him. The head of this headquarters asked if they were going to the bar today. His assistant replied that the newcomers were coming to have a drink. The young man wanted to know what was wrong with them all and followed them. At this time, there were no government employees at the Seoul headquarters either. Not all of them had gone home. The last one who was still at work was the head of this headquarters. She was riding in the elevator. The elevator stopped, and she got off at the floor to report what was happening to the owner. The head of the headquarters wanted to live out the situation to the owner. She caught him watching for some reason, glowing. He asked the head what she thought about everything that had happened at the last moment. The head replied that the demon's behavior was returning to previous patterns. It seemed that he was busy with something completely different. He raised his hand and brought it closer to the glass from which the light was coming. There inside, behind the glass, you could see the same yellow dust that always surrounded the demons. He asked her if she had discovered the reason for the sudden activity. There was someone behind the glass who had a mask on her face. Her hair was flying in different directions. Headquarters said something that she hadn't figured out, but maybe it was a sign that that day was coming. He looked at her behind the glass. Her legs and arms were in chains, and her hair was flying in different directions. He told her that he was not sure yet. Then he turned around and walked in the other direction. He asked the head of the headquarters to make sure that the team captains kept their mouths shut about that very day. If ordinary employees of the organization found out about this, then chaos would definitely begin. At this point, the newcomers and their team that they joined had already reached the bar. The young man was sitting looking at the food and he was drooling. The head of headquarters said he didn't understand the point of a party for new employees if the day was coming soon. The agent who worked with him for all these years said even if that day comes, they still have to give them a warm welcome. The young man asked the head what day they were talking about and what was going on. After drinking a little, the head of their team said that in a year, Dima will not fall from the sky like rain, as the prophecy says. The young man thought that if demons were to fall from the sky, then in that case, it would be the end for him. He couldn't even imagine it in a terrible way with her. Then the head of their team said that it was top secret that what he said was classified information. His assistant agent told everyone to take glasses, and they would drink until they vomited. Another agent was not so active, but he did not refuse and drank with them. The agent who was sitting near his workplace from which he had already communicated during the day, sat and thought about only one thing, that he wanted to go home. The captain told the young man that he had better think about tomorrow and drink in moderation. The newcomer who came with him couldn't calm down about why he ended up on Kangwado Island. The captain said that their leader has had enough alcohol and is starting to behave inappropriately. The young man was very scared, but he didn't understand why all these people looked so carefree. The portal that was moved from the ordinary world to the dark world has frozen. The gates of this portal continued to be open, and demons continued to fly out from there. Despite the fact that this portal was in a completely different dimension and on a different plane, it was open. And the sharp claws of one of the demons appeared, which he tried to use to get out through this portal. After the sharp kitchens appeared, several paws with such sharp claws crawled out. Through this open portal, a huge demon began to appear. It was still unclear what it was. But at that very moment, an alarm was sounded on each of their phones and a signal sounded. Despite the fact that they had already drunk, each of them, seeing the alarm and the signal, seemed to have come to their senses. One of the agents, when she saw Dima's signal at night, she was very surprised. She thought that everything would be calm at night. The captain very quickly took off her apron, which she had put on, so as not to get dirty when she ate, and told everyone else that she would be back soon. One of the newbies told the captain that he would go with her. The captain looked at the young man and categorically told him that no, she would not take him with her. Then she looked at the second one and said that she would go with Han Maru. The young man almost choked. Within a few seconds, they were sitting in the car and driving at high speed in the direction where the demon appeared. The young man sat in the car, leaned his forehead against the glass. He could not understand how it could be that in just a year, Dima Anna would be knocked down in droves. He wanted to understand when this day would come and what would happen next. Would it really be all over and he wouldn't be able to do anything about it? The captain called the young man. He turned his head sharply and responded. She told him not to worry so much about this prophecy because it was just words. The young man did not understand why she was so calm and how he could not worry. The captain said that she was sure that their superiors were already working on this. There were a lot of strong people at headquarters. In fact, their only duty is to hunt down demons and kill them. Kanmaru thought that he was very scared, but he was not afraid at all. And he thought it sounded really cool. The captain said that it seemed like the young man had a special ability, and she was looking forward to seeing it again. The car moved along the highway at speed, and they almost reached the place where the demon appeared. The young man thought that the words about him having a special ability sounded like a compliment. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. The captain told him that she had never met such a glutton as he was until that moment. And I haven't seen anyone like him recover as quickly as he did. The young man looked at the captain and asked the captain about his gluttony. Did he really eat a lot at the bar today? He thought that if the ability is transmitted from the bite of the first Dima, then that demon was a monster devourer. But he still asked the captain what she meant by that. The girl looked at him, smiled, and said that his ability to literally eat a demon's guts. When he heard about his ability, he was surprised and even felt a little sick. He had nothing to say. He asked her again in an uncertain voice if this was true and he was a demon eater. After some time they were there, and in front of them was one of the demons who managed to get out through the open portal. The captain didn't bother with him for long and pierced his mouth right through. She came very close to him and ordered this demon to shut up since she always... The young man was so scared that he approached the monster and asked the captain if she really wanted him to eat this creature. The captain said that as she saw if he absorbs the flesh of a demon, then this monster can no longer regenerate. The captain ordered the young man to bite him. He took one paw in his hands. The young man thought that perhaps she was speaking correctly. If he had an ability, then he should use it. She said that he was special. For a moment he thought that he should think that it was just an octopus and he could bite it calmly. The young man opened his mouth and thought that he needed to do it immediately. His mouth started to water. When he brought the paw of this monster to himself, the card was not even able to bite it. The captain ordered him to start eating this monster, she screamed. Is he really kidding? The young man cried and said that it was disgusting. The captain didn't stop and told him to do it. She was ready to hit him. The very next morning, everything was as quiet as usual at the headquarters of the Dust Rapid Response Department. A young man who came to work, he lay down on the table and thought that he was dying from pain in his head. The second newbie approached him and addressed him as a first-level newbie. He asked if it was true that he threw up on the task. He called him a loser. Kanmaru raised his head, looked at this guy and said what he needed from him. He didn't want to talk to him at all. This newbie shouted, does he really want to know what he needs? He still hasn't taken a step out of the office because of an idiot like him. He tried to explain that the captain was trying to train him, and he was just getting in the way. He then turned away from the young man and started walking away, calling him an incompetent bastard. Hanmaru wondered if this was serious, but he was right. He really needed to get it together. At that moment, as he thought, a siren sounded, which meant that one of the demons had once again gone free. The captain stood up from her workstation and called Hanmaru. But what was her surprise when she did not see the young man at her workplace? Immediately after talking with the second newcomer, he went to the toilet. He closed himself off so as not to listen or hear anyone. His head hurt very badly. The young man still couldn't understand whether he could really eat demons as the captain told him, being in her right mind. He understood that although he had received abilities, it was not enough to start using them. When he came out of the toilet, he thought that perhaps he would rest today, and tomorrow he would deal with this issue properly. But his thoughts were immediately interrupted by the captain. She was unhappy because she couldn't find him. She asked him if he had really been hiding in the toilet all this time. The young man said he thought he had food poisoning after he bit the demon and felt sick all the time and laughed. He didn't understand why she approached him with this question and why she was looking for him. At that moment, the captain said that it seemed he was not at all suitable for this job. The young man turned his head, looked at her, and asked what she said. The captain tried to explain to him that he shouldn't work for the government just because he had mental abilities. She explained to him that he could simply sign a non-disclosure agreement and live under surveillance for the rest of his life. Quite a lot of people do that. When he heard that he had to live under surveillance, he didn't understand what would happen to his personal life. The captain said that it was still better than him dying. Morally weak people cannot last long in their service. And then she added that it's even worse, and that civilians could die for people like him. She told him that if he couldn't do his job, he should leave their team immediately. She came very close to him so that she could see his eyes and stop for 1 second. At that moment, she said that they didn't have enough employees to support people like him. Then the captain moved on and the young man remained standing in that place. At that moment, all his dreams and all his plans collapsed. Everything was not as he wanted. He continued to stand in the corridor and think about the words that the captain had just said to him. In their office, work was going on. Everyone sat at their workstation and pretended to work. The head of their headquarters shouted. He wanted to know if any of the staff had seen Kanmaru. He was interested in the question of where he was last time and why he was not at his workplace. The young man decided that he shouldn't go back and he could just leave his job. He went to think, stopped on the bridge, and began to look at the water and the mountains. He decided that he really should leave this job. It was better to live under surveillance than to die during the battle. He had already decided everything for himself. At that moment, he decided that he should call his mother and tell her that he was quitting. He thought that there was no point in looking for a job because in a year, as everyone said, demons would attack. He called his mother. When he heard that she answered, he said that he wanted to tell him something. She wasn't very talkative, so he asked her where she was. His mother at that moment said that she was on Mount Invag. Kanmaru was very upset and started telling her why she went there. He told her never to go to the mountains. His mother pretended she didn't hear anything, so she ended the conversation with him, but didn't hang up. When she raised her head up, she saw that there was a lot of yellow dust, and she wondered where all that dust was coming from on the mountain. Her son heard everything she said. He was in shock. He tried to shout to her. He understood what it meant. At that moment, he saw that her phone was switched off, and the connection was interrupted. The young man repeated again, yellow dust in the mountains. He understood that his mother was in danger. At this point, the team was already in the Inwang Mountains. The captain of this team said that this was a level 5 monster, so they should be careful. The captain looked at one of the newbies and didn't understand what he was doing. He walked up to the little guy, put his hand on his shoulder, and asked the new guy what he was doing. The newbie continued to look up. The captain raised his head and saw a monster sitting on a tree branch. When they started to look closely, they saw that in the paws of this monster there was a human hand, and it was absorbing this human hand. He bites a human hand with his fangs so that blood spurts in all directions. This monster had only one eye in the middle of its head, but it was very voracious. Kanmaru heard that his mother had gone to the mountains, and that the connection there had been interrupted. He started running with all his might. He shouted loudly, "No." One of the newbies who came with my ODM man was on this mountain team. He couldn't use his abilities. He sat and watched as all the other agents that were on his team were dead, and this level 5 demon was devouring their captain. The young man thought that the Invarg mountain team was destroyed. At that moment, another member of this team came up and said that he was a little late. This guy turned around and told the newbie to request emergency support from Seoul HQ. He was the owner of the clone demon ability. The newbie said that he understood everything and went to complete this task. He headed to the place where he could contact Seoul headquarters. When he passed the restricted area sign, he saw a phone in a box. The newbie thought that smartphones don't work in the yellow dust zone, and he has only one option. This old phone is the only way to contact them. This newbie succeeded and sent a request for support to Seoul HQ. The head of the headquarters reported that she had just received a request for support from a company in Mount Inwang. She looked at the map and understood that it was very dangerous if this Dima would break out of the green restricted area and end up in the yellow one, where there are currently 15 tourist trails. This could have led to the possibility of civilian casualties. They should not have allowed this to happen. She explained that this demon is a demon devourer. He will not leave a single living person if he breaks out of this zone. If this happens, it will be a huge catastrophe with many human casualties. The head of the headquarters understood perfectly well that time was running out, and there was no time to hesitate. She ordered her staff to immediately go to that mountain and deal with that demon. Each of the employees was ready to go there and not standing and waiting for when they could do it. The young man drove his car very quickly to the point where they were able to take him. He got out of the car, thanked the driver, and ran very quickly to the side. He ran up to the sign that said hiking trail, but it was already temporarily closed. He looked at the people who were ready to follow this tourist trail, but he did not find his mother. Then he went to the next hiking trail. His mom was not there. He thought that his mom was still on the mountain. He approached one of the employees and told him to let him in because he would only come in for a second because his mother was still in the mountains. This employee said that it was impossible. He started talking about how wild animals were found there. It was dangerous. The young man understood everything perfectly, and there were no wild animals there. There was a demon. He needed to hurry. He ran away from this path to the side and decided to climb the mountain where there was no path. He decided to climb straight up the cliff that led to this mountain. He was walking along this steep cliff, and he was thinking only about one thing, about his mother. He asked her to be careful. When he climbed up, he saw yellow dust there. This meant only one thing. There was a monster present there. His mother asked what happened to her companion and why she couldn't walk. The girl replied that she couldn't see anything because of the yellow dust, and that's why she tripped, and her leg was swollen. Mom turned her back to her and told her to climb on her back. Mom replied that she was ready to carry her on her back. At that moment, her companion screamed very loudly. They raised their heads up and saw an incomprehensible silhouette somewhere high in the mountains. This kiss was moving very quickly towards them, and it seemed that he would be very close any minute. The young man's mother tried to see what it was, but couldn't figure it out. She saw a hand approaching her. This hand was covered in yellow sand. At some point, fear and shock appeared in her eyes. She couldn't even say anything. When the young man sat down, his mother shouted to her so that she would recognize him. He had finally found her. His mother looked at him and did not understand how he ended up in these mountains, because he should be in a completely different place. The young man tried to explain that he saw her post that she had put up. His mother wanted to know how his work was, why he wasn't at work, and decided to visit her. The young man looked down at her and said that it didn't matter at all now. His friend's mother was also very happy. She had never seen her son, who was always bragging that he had become a civil servant. His mother said that she only had to wait for him to get married, but he was not popular at all among girls. Kanmaru shouted at his mother and said that she was not being serious at all. Now was not the time for that. They needed to run before this Dima showed up. At that moment, he saw that the leaves from the tree began to fall on his head. At that moment, he understood everything. He decided to raise his head and see that this monster was indeed right above his head. It was already here. The young man saw its huge mouth and the readiness of this monster to attack him. Kanmaru, when he came to this monster, felt some kind of trembling. He caught himself thinking that he was starting to have a panic attack again. The first question that came to his mind was why he came here at all. He didn't know the answer. He knew something was wrong with him. On Gangwado, he passed out every time he saw a monster. Well, on the other hand, he understood that someone like him could really save his mother. His mother and her friend didn't understand why he was acting so strangely. They thought that something was wrong with him and that he could fall at any moment. At that moment, Kanmaru was bitter from the pain that was in his chest. He activated his abilities. When his mother watched him, she couldn't understand anything. She just started screaming at him with all her might. The monster heard this cry and he turned his head and headed towards his mother and her friend. He jumped from the tree in order to run to them. He saw them as his prey. While his mother and her friend were looking at the young man, the monster was practically behind them. The young man jumped and screamed no. He had to stop this monster at any cost and not let him kill his mother. Since he jumped from this cliff, he tumbled down into them. At some point, he even thought that he wouldn't succeed and that he had appeared too late. He saw this mon approaching his mother, and in one more second he would destroy her. He was very close with his mouth open, ready to swallow her alive. The young man's mother was very frightened and covered her face with her hand. Kanmaru couldn't allow him to touch his mother. He shouted at her to move away. His mother did just that. She stepped aside and the monster, running, just fell down next to him. The young man's mother and her friend stood there, not understanding what was happening, and the monster was lying on the ground next to them. The young man calmed down a little, but he still tried to get to this monster. When this monster started to rise, he saw that there were many blades in his back. He did not understand where these blades came from. The young man's mother began to ask him what this strange monster was that almost attacked them. Then she raised her head and looked at her son and asked him what was on his head. Hanmao raised his head up and saw that there were many blades above his head. At that moment, he didn't understand why there were so many blades around his head. Then he came up with a version. He remembered about that very monster, and that there were many blades above his head. He realized that the ability had been transferred to him from the monster he had fought, and most likely after he ate it, he received all the abilities of this monster. Of course, he didn't understand how it all happened, but in any case, he was able to stop this monster. One after another, blades appeared on his back and gathered on his head. The young man understood where he got these abilities from, but still didn't know what to do with them. He tried to control these blades with his 2 fingers, and he succeeded. Now he needed to understand why he could use the power of that monster and even control them. He remembered the captain's words that his ability should stop the regeneration of demons by eating their flesh. If this was true, then he can also absorb their abilities in addition to their flesh. He then thought that maybe with this newly acquired power he could kill this monster too. He looked at this monster and thought that it was still lying there, which meant it was somehow weak. He didn't understand how the Inwang Mountain team could miss something like that. The young man was sitting near the fence. He was shaking with fear when some man approached him. This young man was afraid to even raise his head up. He only looked down. This man who came up asked him how he felt. Then this man said that he was sent from Seoul headquarters. The 2 of them are here to catch the demon. The 2 asked the young man why he let the demon escape. The young man tried to justify himself. He said that this monster was very scary and he destroyed their entire team. The man thought and did not understand how it could be that he destroyed the entire team because their captain was the owner of the ability of a demon of the 7th level. The second asked the young man what kind of abilities such a level 5 monster had that he was able to destroy the entire team. At that moment, the young man said that he had a mirror on his forehead. Hanmaru also noticed that something flashed there on this monster, but he didn't understand what. When this monster began to slowly lift his entire body, he saw that small spikes appeared on his body and grew. And these spikes become exactly the same clicks as the young man. He was a monster who was in the mirror and copied all the abilities of his opponent. The young man was very scared when he saw that this monster had exactly the same abilities as he did, and the fact that he directed a dozen blades in his direction. Kanmaru was not prepared for such an attack, and therefore all these blades hit his body. When he tasted the blood, his ability to activate even more force made him salivate. Kanmaru received quite a lot of wounds. Dozens of blades pierced his body. The young man thought that this monster had just used the same ability that he had. He looked at this monster and saw that there was something shining in the middle of his head. Looking closer, he saw his own reflection. This monster had a mirror on his head. The young man, despite the pain, began to remove the blades from his body that the monster had pointed at him. He thought that most likely this monster has a very interesting ability from mirroring. And this meant only one thing, that he copies exactly his subscriber Kanmaru, all clicks from his body. Hanmaru thought if his theory is correct, then the monster should repeat absolutely everything after him, should repeat every movement that the young man will make. So he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. He wanted to see if this monster would repeat after him. The monster, without thinking twice, raised his paw and snapped his clawed fingers in exactly the same way. When the young man saw this, he thought that his theory was correct and it gave him goosebumps. The young mother and her friend called him. He turned his head and looked in their direction. Kanmaru approached his mother and saw that she was sitting on the ground. He asked her how she felt. When she lowered her eyes, he saw that her knee was injured. He thought that the yellow dust carried heels, ordinary people. His mother looked at her son, and then she said that he had blood on his clothes. Hanmaru answered her that it was not so. He was completely fine and lifted his shirt. There was not a single scratch on him. The young man turned his head and looked at this monster that was copying him. He thought that he had no one to rely on, and he had to protect his mother. And he needed to do it at any cost. He told his mother to go and hide somewhere with a friend right now. His mother didn't understand why he was talking like that and why he was demanding that they hide immediately. The young man smiled and said that he was a civil servant who protected citizens and that they were now under his protection. Then he turned away and started walking towards this monster. He told his mother that he would be back soon. He couldn't hesitate for a second. He knew that his mother's life depended on it. So he pushed off and ran towards this monster. He didn't have any plan at that moment. The only thing he understood was that he needed to do was to take this monster as far away from his mother as possible. The young man got rid of this monster and continued to run. He carried it as far as possible. When he ran, he activated the abilities that he had. He ran to the edge of the mountain, jumped with this monster, and flew down. The young man's mother stretched out her hand forward. She wanted to stop him. She screamed in fear, but she realized that she couldn't do anything. Her son jumped down with this monster. She didn't know what would happen to him. Kanmaru fell and lay on the ground. He tried to move his hand up and down. He succeeded. Then he tried to shine despite the fact that he received quite serious injuries. He recovered very quickly. Of course, his strength did not recover as quickly as he wanted, but despite this, he tried to get up. The young man looked down where the monster was. He thought only that he had to get this demon away from his mother. He decided that if he could gain some time, the Inwang Mountain team would definitely come to his aid, and then he would be able to deal with him. At the same time, on another part of the mountain, two representatives of the special services who arrived to provide assistance did not understand what was happening. Have you ever seen a picture of how many identical monsters, similar to each other like 2 drops of water, destroy the civil servants of this mountain? They looked at these monsters, and at some point, it even showed them that it was a whole army of identical monsters. One of them asked the other why there were so many identical demons here. He even tried to count them. The second one answered him that the ability of the captain of the Inwang Mountain team is the cloning itself from the mirror of the howling demon copied his abilities. That's why there are so many of them now. They absolutely repeat everything after their opponent. This second one also said that if they destroy the main thing, then all the others will disappear now. It was necessary to understand which body is the main one. His partner said that he didn't give a damn, they could just kill all these demons. Now he punched his fist. He was not afraid of such a large number of these monsters. He was ready to deal with them immediately, so he swung to strike the first of them. His strength and ability consisted in delivering very powerful blows that destroyed everything around him. This special forces officer swung and struck the ground so that all the monsters that were nearby flew away a fairly large distance. The first special agent looked at her colleague and thought that he was completely ignorant to resolve this issue with his fists. He watched as his colleague lifted one monster in each hand as he dealt with them very quickly. But it was clear that among these there was no main body. There was no one to fight with. Now they needed to figure out where the main body was and find it as quickly as possible. Kanmaru stood on a hill above his head where Blades, the demon with whom he fought, completely copied his behavior. When the young man saw that this monster was standing on its paws again, he thought that this monster was recovering very quickly. Hanmaru took a few steps, but his leg had not yet recovered. It was hard for him to walk. He thought that this monster was a pain in the ass. This monster repeated the last words of the young man, and she did it several times. Kanmaru shouted at her not to copy his mother, and most importantly, not to even think about approaching her. The monster didn't understand what they wanted from him. He moved straight towards his mother. The young man threw all the blades at him. These blades were only able to stop this monster, but none of them hurt his body. At that moment, Kanmaru realized that the accuracy of these blades could be improved. Since this monster's ability was in display, he immediately sent one blade towards the young man. This monster copied every movement of the young man and sent a blade in his direction in exactly the same way. This blade reached its target and hit the young man right in the shoulder. Unlike the blades that were aimed towards the monster, what happened made Hanmaru very angry. He understood that he had to stop this monster by any means necessary. So he stood on the very edge of the cliff and sent several blades towards the monster. He shouted at them to just hit. When these blades reached their target, the monster began to growl in pain. The young man, when he saw what had happened and that he had one hit, was very happy. The demon pulled a sharpened blade from his shoulder. He copied the young man completely. The wound that was in the body of this monster healed very quickly with the help of yellow sand. The young man thought that they both had service and ability, but he, the monster, recovers much faster. Kanmaru remembered what happened to him when he went with the captain on a trip because she explained everything to him then. She stood in front of him and said that he didn't listen to her at all, or at least that was the impression she had. He was then lying on the ground covering his face with one hand. He really didn't want to listen to anyone at that moment. When he pulled his hand away, he asked the captain if he was fit for this job and he couldn't fight monsters at all. The captain didn't say anything to him and extended his hand for him to get up from the ground. He squeezed her hand and started to rise. Then she told him that he was just afraid of getting hurt. The captain explained to him that they have the ability to heal in yellow dust, and he should not worry about what will happen to him because everything will be fine with him. Then the young man asked if he was hit with something like a knife, would the pain be the same or not if he used the gluttony ability he needed to eat demons, but then what would happen to his stomach? She held the young man's hand and said nothing to him. At that moment, he became very scared. He asked for forgiveness and said that he was very sorry. Kanmaru then asked the captain if he has another option to fight, or if he has no choice. The captain said that it can be considered that Diamond will be finished when he stops producing yellow dust, so the most effective way is to cut off his head. Then she added that, however, he does not have any killing abilities, unfortunately, but he can only provide support and not cause damage. Then the captain added that he has one very good ability, and it is stronger than everyone else's. It is the ability to heal. That is why he should not be afraid to engage in combat with monsters. In any case, his body will recover very quickly. He thought that it could help him. He had the best regeneration if he was not afraid. The young man also thought that, moreover, thanks to the ability to gluttony, he would also receive the ability to kill. The only thing he was upset about was his terrible aim, which was why he couldn't hit that monster in the throat. The monster climbed up the steep cliff straight towards the young man. Hanmaru knew that he had to make a decision very quickly if he couldn't aim. This monster was very close to him and repeated the last words of his mother. This greatly irritated the young man, so he thought he had only one way to go. He took the blade in his hands and swung it. Then he pushed off and jumped down from that mountain straight onto that monster holding that blade in his hands. The rest of the books that he could use to destroy this monster flew towards the monster. The mirror part of the monster's head reflected the young man falling right on top of him. Hanmaru thought, if he can't aim and hit this monster, then he has only one option left. He just has to kill it with his own hands. Kanmaru was approaching this monster very quickly. He was ready to deal him a fatal blow. When he was very close, he thought that this was most likely a victory, and he could do it. He gets hit right in the mouth, thinking that he has already won and this monster is no longer dangerous. Imagine his surprise when he realized that this monster had blocked his final blow. The paw of this vile monster was approaching the young man's neck. And the next second, she grabbed Kanmaru's neck and tried to squeeze it to kill him. The young man, because he didn't have enough air, began to cough. He was suffocating, and not the two of them were hanging in the air. The monster asked the young man why he was so stubborn. Hanmaru didn't know what to do. They hung and held on only because this monster grabbed a stone with one of its paws, but this stone began to fall off this mountain. And the two of them, the young man and the monster who held him by the throat, began to fall down. The monster did not loosen his hand for a second and did not let it go from the young man's neck. It seemed that on the contrary, he began to squeeze harder and harder so that Hanmaru could hardly breathe. When they were falling and were very close to the ground, the monster made the young man fall first and hit the rocks. Kanmaru lay on the ground and thought of only one thing, that he couldn't breathe. He groaned and coughed. His eyes were rolling back. He was losing consciousness. He was thinking about only one thing about his ability to gluttony. He needed to use this ability. He had to devour this monster. He couldn't hesitate. The young man looked straight into the mirror that was on the monster's head and barely saw his reflection in it. The monster did not hesitate, and everything that the young man thought about mentally began to carry out himself. He took and bit the young man's neck so that he felt wild pain. At that moment, Kanmaru remembered that he had one blade left in his hand that he had not used, and it could be useful to him. He swung his hand and ran it across the monster's neck so that he didn't have time to react and didn't have time to repeat after him. The young man was very upset because this monster managed to bite him on the neck. The monster was lying on the ground with a blade sticking out of its neck. The young man's head began to spin and it seemed as if he was losing consciousness. His vision became worse, but he understood that this monster pulled a blade from his neck. He just didn't understand how this could be. Hanmaru also did not understand why his bleeding did not stop and he could not heal. At that moment, the young man thought about whether it could be that this monster and his ability to gluttony copied. If this was so, then he is not capable of regeneration. Then he thought how long a person can hold out after such bleeding. He understood that he had no time at all, and if he collapsed right here on this spot, then what would happen? He needed some kind of plan. The next moment he remembered the captain's words when he was lying on the grass. She told him to get up. She was very angry with him and said how many times can he lose consciousness. Then he tried to explain to her that he was not losing knowledge. It was just a panic disorder. He couldn't control it. He explained that his chest was being squeezed and it felt like he was going to die. Then the captain told him that if that was the case, he should try to overcome himself even more diligently. She tried to explain to him that otherwise he would not just feel the proximity of death, but would actually die if he behaved like that. Then she said that he got it into his head that he was the last line of defense, and if he went down then civilians would be in danger. The young man heard his mother's voice, which was heard somewhere very close. She stood on the edge of the abyss and screamed his name very loudly. She wanted him to hear her and respond. At that moment he realized that he was the only defense and the very last line. If he suddenly starts to panic now as usual or has a panic attack, then everything will be over, he thought. He took one blade in his hands and squeezed it very tightly. The monster copied everything that the young man did. It also took the blade in its paw. At that moment he remembered the captain and thought that even if he died, he would take this demon with him, after which he stood up and walked towards this monster. He bit his lower lip with all his might to taste the blood and to awaken his abilities. Then he ran forward and started screaming very loudly. The demon who was opposite him also began to scream and run towards the young man. They were approaching each other very quickly. They were separated by a very small distance, almost a few steps. The monster held out a blade in front of itself in order to harm the young man. When they were very close, this monster struck him from the side with a blade right in the stomach. The young man felt severe pain, tears started flowing from his eyes, and at some point he even decided that this was the end. But with a few efforts he sent his blade upwards, and for some time he held this blade right above them. Now it was necessary to deliver an accurate blow. This monster asked the young man why he was doing this. The young man grabbed the monster so tightly that they seemed to be one. Kanmaru could no longer stop. He had to finish this matter and kill this monster. He started collecting all his glitches, those that were in the tree, in the ground, and in other places. He collected them all together with the one who was in the air above him. And then all these glitches that he had directed towards the monster and towards himself. The young man tried to hold the monster so that these blades would only hit the monster and cause damage to it. The demon began to scream loudly. He could not copy anything because he had no abilities. These sticks hit both the monster's body and the young man's body, making holes in it. Kanmaru held the body of this monster with all his might. He understood that he had to destroy it. After several blows with the blade, first one of the monster's paws was cut off, and then the second. But the main blade was on the young man, and he continued to control him. The next thing he did was point that blade and cut off the head of that monster, leaving the body in the hands of the young man. The severed head lay on the ground and other parts of the monster's body lay near it. The young man's body also contained a large number of these blades, but he felt no pain at all. At some point he didn't even understand what happened. He threw the body of this monster to the ground. Then he looked around and saw that this monster was not generating, it was not healing, which meant he had won. Then he decided to lie down on the ground and rest. He was very tired. At this time, in another part of this mountain, all the monsters that were cloned from the main monster also fell and died. One of the special services who tried to fight them said that the clones were disappearing, which meant they killed the main body. His colleague said that he was wrong, and the main body died somewhere else. It is definitely not here. Then the Secret Service agent added that it was unclear who killed him. The young man, after resting a little, stood up and moved his head. He felt that the blood was no longer flowing. He thought that he was very lucky that after the death of this monster, his wounds began to heal. Hanmaru caught herself thinking that this time he really thought he was dying. He went towards his mother because he was worried that she would not worry. He took a few steps forward and heard his father's voice telling him to eat this monster. The young man stopped and saw that it was indeed his father behind him, who raised his hand and pointed at that monster. He said that the young man ate him. Kanmaru looked at his father and thought that these were memories that he had forgotten and nothing more. But in his mind, he still asked him why his father kept asking him to eat these monsters. The young man thought that this demon with whom he fought was very strong and had an unusual ability, and if he really absorbs it, then through gluttony he will gain its ability. He remembered his captain's words that in a year, demons would fall from the sky like rain. That's what the prophecy said. And when that day came, he had to be strong enough to protect his mother. So he thought that he really needed to absorb this demon. He sat down, took his paw, and said that it was time to start absorbing this demon. Without thinking for long, he sank down and began to dig a piece of snack, biting off from the demon's body. When he finished, blood was running down his face. The young man realized that he had wiped all the blood off with his sleeve, and thought that from that moment on, he would eat every strong demon in his path. He understood that now no one could stop him, and that he had the ability to protect his mother. After everything that happened, the young man sent his mother to the cardiology clinic at Sandrum University. His mother clearly remembered that she fainted when she was on the mountain, and she didn't remember anything else. When the young man tried to tell her something that happened there, she said that she didn't remember it at all. Kanmaru, of course, asked her again if she was telling the truth, and if she really didn't remember anything at all. He thought it was very good, and there really was no need to remember all this. At some point, he even became very scared for her life, because this monster was very close to her. And this monster practically attacked her and was ready to pet her. At that moment, his mother was in shock and she passed out. She doesn't remember anything at all about what happened in the mountains. It was all because of the yellow dust. She took her phone and showed it to her son to watch the incident with the fire on the mountain and how some tourists were injured. At that moment, the young man told his mother that she should understand so that she would not go to those mountains again. Then his mother said that her friends told her that they saw someone there who looked like his father, so she believed them and went. At that moment, the young man stopped and thought, to be honest, his father also disappeared in the mountains, so could that demon be his father? He tried to remember what happened to him and his father on the very day his father disappeared. He stood in the mountains near a tree and looked up at it. He was still very small then. The only thing he felt then was a drop of blood falling from above onto his face. And then, when he looked, he saw that his father was spitting blood, and this blood was pouring straight onto the ground. The boy then saw that his father was being gnawed by a huge monster that was on the branches of this tree. At that moment, the young man stood and realized that he could be right, because he did not see how his father died. He even became scared because what he saw now in his vision, he did not see it in reality and do not remember what he saw. Mom called the young man several times. He came to his senses, turned his head and asked what she needed. At that moment, his mother asked why he was so pale, because he had just been completely normal. His mother asked him if it was really that hard for him to work in the office at this time. The young man smiled and told her not to worry at all. He thought he was already starting to get used to it. After all that had happened, the young man felt that he should return to the headquarters of the civil service to his workplace. When he was standing almost at the door, the agent who was on the same team with her shouted at him to come in. The young man opened the door slightly. He did not understand how she could know that he was standing behind these doors. Hanmaru walked into the office and wished everyone a good morning. The agent stood up and asked him if he really thought this morning was so good and why he suddenly disappeared yesterday. The new guy who came to this job with him said that it was obvious to everyone, and then he added that most likely Yahanmaru just got scared and ran away. The young man walked up to his workplace, looked down, and asked everyone for forgiveness. At that moment, the captain said that yesterday she completely forgot to tell everyone that Kanmaru looked sick and she allowed him to go home. It was very unexpected for the young man. He raised his head and looked at the captain. The girl didn't explain anything. She just looked at him and didn't say a word to me. One of the agents asked the captain if she was joking and how could she forget about something like that. The captain said that she was asking for an apology. The agent approached the captain and began to complain to her about how she had apologized and that was it. But who would deal with all the matters, and if she was allowed to get away with a lot of things, this would not continue forever. The captain asked her what was allowed to get away with it. Their argument was interrupted by an alarm, which meant only one thing. Another demon had been released through the portal. The captain put on her jacket and said that this is the second level. She will listen to lectures when she returns. Kanmaru jumped up from his seat and said that he would go with her. Everyone in the office was very surprised. The captain was also surprised. She did not expect such a thing from the young man. They had to climb to the very top of the mountain in order to understand in which part of the mountain this monster was located. The captain walked first, a young man walked behind her, and the rest of the team followed him. The young man turned to the captain, asked him for forgiveness, and said that she shouldn't have taken his guilt upon herself. The captain, without turning her head, told him that he left only because she was too harsh with him. Then she took a few steps forward and asked him. She didn't understand why he came back. The young man, without thinking twice, answered her that he was now ready to fight. The captain looked at him. She couldn't believe what was about to happen, what he was saying. Ahead of them, there was yellow dust and the silhouette of a huge monster was visible. All the special agents who were dealing with this matter stopped to assess the situation. The monster that was right in front of them was really very huge and very fat. This monster repeated the young man's last words that he was ready to fight, but he was just fat. The captain said that despite the fact that this monster is of the 2nd level, it cannot be underestimated. And then she added that even the Yingwang mountain team was destroyed by a measly 5th level demon. The young man thought that she was talking about the very creature he had fought yesterday. One of the agents remarked that, fortunately, it seemed that the team from the Snool headquarters had dealt with him. Then this agent added that the monsters are forced to team up with the owner of the ability of the 7th level and above, and not just cool ones. The young man was very hurt by these words. He did not understand what they were talking about, because in fact he did it, and it was he who dealt with this monster. He turned away and walked away because he couldn't even say anything about it, because they all thought he just left work early. When he stood behind, he thought that he wanted to be recognized. The captain did not understand what this demon who was in front of them was doing. She wanted to know why he was rubbing his armpits. He was acting very suspiciously. The young man extended his hand and told the captain and the agent to stop. He told them to step aside, and he could deal with this demon himself. The captain was a little shocked. She asked again what he meant. The second agent did not understand how he, the 1st level, was going to deal with a 2nd level monster. The young man turned his head back and said that he would definitely cope with this monster. He stood right in front of this huge monster that had lost its armpits. The young man lowered his head and took it with his hands. He needed to understand which ability he should use. And he activated the ability from the mirror of the howling demon, and on his forehead appeared exactly the same mirror as the last demon he destroyed. The human daughter thought that it was finally time for him to show what he was capable of, because he had grown up since he defeated the monster on Mount Inwang, and he was no longer a useless member of the team. He began to repeat after the monster all the same movements that he did, and to emit the same smells as the demon himself. The smell emitted by the young man was many times stronger than the smell of the monster itself. The monster continued to scream that he could handle it. I repeat the last words of the young man. At that moment, the young man said that it was of course very disgusting and the smell was simply unbearable. But he was not going to lose this fight under any circumstances. He began to approach this monster. And he attacked him. It was an attack. The monster staggered and began to fall. The agent who was with him on the mission couldn't breathe because there was an unbearable stench all around. The agent said that the ability of this monster under the muscle stench could be considered a chemical weapon. The agent and the captain could barely stand on their feet. The stench was unbearable. At some point, Captain Pasha woke up and almost fell. The agent said that she needed to hold on as well as someone with the 7th level of ability could be influenced by a conventional war. The young man turned his head to see how the captain was feeling and how she was reacting to what he was doing. Tears were not flowing from his eyes because of this. He understood that this monster would not go on at this rate. It was definitely not enough to finish them off. Then the young man said that this monster should not look at him high. He is much faster than him. The young man could no longer bear it. Tears were flowing from his eyes and nose. The stench seemed to be everywhere. So he took a few steps to get as close as possible to this monster. He copied all his actions and got closer and closer to him. And after just a few steps, he was very close. He could look right into his mouth. The young man thought that he had to gather all his strength and deliver the final blow. Then he raised his 2 hands and shouted at this monster to bite and push him back. The monsters couldn't hold on, but he was too fat on his legs, so he plodded and started to fall. With a very loud crash, he fell on his back and lay motionless. The monster was neutralized. The young man continued to stand with his back to his colleagues. He needed to finish what he had started. The only way he could destroy the monster was to eat it. The young man turned his face, looked at the captain and the agent, and said that he had won. He smiled. They stood to the side, holding each other very pale, because they thought they would suffocate from this stench. They decided that they needed to go to the mountain river and wash their eyes to get rid of this smell. When the captain came to her senses, she washed her hands and shook them. She looked down at the young man. He washed his eyes with clean water because his eyes hurt so much. The captain told the young man that if he eats a monster, he absorbs its powers using the ability of gluttony. The young man told her that the last monster he ate had the ability to howl in the mirror, which is why he was able to use the same power as the armpit demon. The agent who was with them started laughing and talking about how Hanmaru said that they could handle it. He thought it was just funny, made a very loud statement, and then attacked with armpit stench. It's just some kind of stinky ability." He laughed loudly for a long time. The young man was a little upset. He wondered if this was really such a smelly ability. The captain tried to calm him down. She said that it was not like that at all, and he tried hard. He began to work much better. These words, of course, calmed the young man down a little, but when he turned his head and looked at the captain, he became a little upset, because she thought that although it was a little disgusting, he had to eat demands. These words struck the young man as if with an electric shock. He did not expect that he would be told that what he was doing was very disgusting. The captain was saying that the guy had done a great job, so he needed to take a break, and she was going to check the yellow dust measuring device. At this point, he was left alone and decided that he really needed to sit down and rest. He held his head and thought that of all the possible monsters he had met the most terrifying one, and in the end he had also disgraced himself. He thought it was his chance to make up for his failures and gain recognition, but everything turned out as usual. The young man heard someone's voice calling him, and he turned his head. In front of him stood the owner of Seoul headquarters. He wanted to know if he was really Han Maru. The young man raised his head and asked the stranger who he was and why he was interested in him. The stranger asked the young man again. After all, it was he who killed the 5th-level demon on Mount Inwang. Then he lowered his face closer to the young man. He wanted to examine him. He couldn't understand how it was possible to do this with only a 1st-level ability. The young man did not hide anything. He replied that it was indeed he who killed this monster. Then the stranger smiled and extended his hand to him so that the young man could. Then he said that he wanted to take him to Seoul headquarters. The young man was really very confused. He didn't expect that someone wanted to take him away. The man standing in front of him said he knew about the Seoul headquarters team. Kanmaru answered him that of course he heard that this is where the demons are, or rather where the top elite are located. The young man froze again. He wanted to ask why they wanted to gather him in Seoul headquarters. The stranger standing in front of him said that he knows how to notice potential in people, and he saw this potential in the young man. Kanmaru did not understand what potential was being discussed. It seemed to him that his abilities were very minimal and that he had not yet achieved anything. After some time, when the head of the Seoul headquarters saw the owner of this headquarters, she wanted to clarify with him. She was interested in the question of why he rescheduled the meeting and where he had been all this time, why she had not been able to contact him. The owner turned his head and looked at the head of the headquarters and said that there was one newcomer who caught his attention. The head of the headquarters asked the owner if he really meant his son. She clarified that his son's name was Song Woo Yi Lee, could not imagine that they could meet. The owner responded that his son will not meet with him after the divorce. His son thinks that he is wrong and he hates him. The owner put his hand on the chair and said that he was interested in a completely different recruit. The head of the headquarters asked her boss again if he still thought that the recent high-level demon appeared because of that new guy. The owner raised his head, looked at the head of the headquarters, and said that he did not just think it, but he felt it. The owner told her to keep an eye on Kangwado Island because he thought something unusual was going to happen there soon. The portal was opened again and another demon came out of it. Yellow sand was all over the corridor. It seemed that the portal opened exactly like the door to the refrigerator, and there was the same passage. It was really necessary to see if anything unusual would appear during this guy's stay. Another day has arrived at Kangwado Island Dust Rapid Response Department. The young man was at work early in the morning. He was happy after yesterday's proposal. He was thinking about only one thing, that he would soon be working at the Seoul headquarters. It was just great. But suddenly he thought about the team he would be moving to, and not only fighting very dangerous demons. He sat at his desk and thought of only one thing, that safety was his top priority. He wanted peace. On the other hand, he thought it was very good that he was finally recognized, and not as just anyone, but as the best of the best, and was offered a transfer to the main headquarters. When he raised his head up, he saw the second newcomer in front of him with a very dissatisfied face. This guy addressed him as a 1st-level civil servant. The young man raised his head and was a little offended. This newbie asked Hanmaru why he was grinning so nastily all day long. He was watching him all day long. He then added that there was nothing surprising about such an incompetent 1st-level person like him, probably enjoying lazing around in the office. And he also added that most likely, the young man was just a coward. He was talking about the fact that he was not accepted to the rural headquarters because of his incompetence. Hanmaru got very angry but decided that this time he would not remain silent. He asked this guy which of them was incompetent. The guy jumped up from his workplace and started insulting him about how he was a bastard and asking him to repeat what he had just said. He shouted at the young man that he was fighting with armpit warfare and was not capable of anything at all. Kanmaru felt very unpleasant and he got angry and wanted to say something in response but stopped. He looked at the agent who was with him during the last destruction of the monster and thought that he was a complete chatterbox. This agent, as always, was sitting at his workplace and playing a game. When he heard what was being said, he began to copy the movement of the young man. Everyone turned their heads and started looking and laughing very loudly along with the head of this headquarters. The head of the headquarters laughed so much that he even started to cry. The young man thought to himself that he was really annoyed by this old fart and what assholes they all were here. The agent approached him and asked everyone to be quiet. She said that it was enough to bully Kanmaru. He didn't deserve it at all. The agent told him that he had done a great job. The young man thanked Mrs. Yun. He had not expected that from her. Well, she immediately said that before everyone hid in the toilet, but now with such abilities you can fight. This is excellent progress, and thanked him. The young man thought that he really hated everything that had happened to him recently, and he was very ashamed. He didn't want to be here. He looked at the pile, but she didn't react at all. She drank her tea and looked at the monitor. He thought that her indifference was worse than everyone else's reaction. Kanmaru was very upset. He thought only about one thing, that everyone around him considered him incompetent. He held his smartphone in his hands with only one thing in mind. This stranger he met on the mountain told him to call as soon as the young man makes a decision. His eyes and said that he definitely needed to forget about these humiliations and start all over again. He decided that he should go to the Seoul headquarters. The alarm sounded. The captain stood up from her workplace and said that an alarm had been declared. A second-level demon had come out, and she wanted to choose who would go with her. Her hand was grabbed by the second newbie. She didn't expect that he could do such a thing. The guy said that this time he shouldn't choose anyone. This time he will go himself no matter what. The young man raised his eyes and began to explain that one could die of boredom in their headquarters and that he could not stand it any longer. Then the young man turned his head and told Kanmar that he wanted him to go with him. The guy then added that he wanted them to get along as newbies and should go on this thing together. After some time, they climbed one of the mountain peaks where the demon's emission was recorded. The first to go up the path was a level 7 novice, followed by Hanmaru. This guy who went out on a mission even seemed to have a better mood. He started smiling despite the fact that he was climbing up very quickly. For some reason, Kanmaru caught herself thinking that he didn't want to stay with this psycho for a minute longer. In his opinion, he was going crazy. He decided that he needed to end this very quickly and call the owner. When they reached the very top, the guy saw, and for what he does not understand what he is doing here, and it was already starting to piss him off. Kanmaru did not understand what was happening. He raised his head and looked forward. He asked what he meant. The guy raised his hand and pointed his index finger at the house and said, "Is he blind and can't see the yellow dust coming from that house?" The young man didn't really understand what was happening. He saw a house and saw yellow dust coming down from this house. He became interested in how the people who were inside. The guy took a few steps forward and told Hanmaru to follow him. The young man thought about why he was ordering him. They opened the gate, but they didn't see anything suspicious. They decided to move on. The guy said he couldn't understand anything because the dust coming from inside was much deeper than from outside. It was level 4 or higher. When they went inside, they really saw very thick yellow dust, but there was no one in this house. The corridor was completely empty. Nothing was visible except yellow dust. Hanmaru told his partner that fortunately, the house seemed empty, and then added that he should be careful because they didn't know where the monster might jump out from. Kanmaru tried to explain to his partner to stop because he didn't listen to him at all and wandered around the house very carelessly. Walking along a long corridor, they came to one of the doors, and thick yellow dust was coming out through the cracks in this door. Parrot said that there must be a demon in this room because of which they were called on this mission. The guy walked up to the door, took the handle, tried to turn it first one way then the other. He didn't understand why it was closed. Hanmaru tried to stop his partner. He asked him to wait because they didn't know what could jump out of there. But his partner said that he was in the way and that he should get out of the way. The young man's partner took a glove out of his pocket and put it on his hand. Then he said, "If this door doesn't open by itself and the lock is closed, then it means you just need to break this door into splinters," and started twisting his finger. Kanmaru prepared himself for the door to actually shatter into pieces. He covered his face with his hand. The guy tried to break this door, but he couldn't do it. Kanmaru realized that this was not a way out of this situation. But at some point he was very happy because he was still a living guy and did not understand why his ability did not work. Hanmaru was a little happy because his partner was so self-confident and nothing worked out for him. After which the guy lowered his head and tried to look through the crack at what was in this room. When he looked through the crack in the door lock, he saw a very thick yellow fog that was everywhere. Somewhere in the distance, he saw the silhouette of a monster. but it seemed to him that it was not moving at all. When he tried to see what kind of monster it was, he saw a very thin monster who was sitting with his legs tucked under him and his head down. Kanmaru pushed his partner aside and said that he also wanted to see what was going on behind that door. The young man did not understand why this monster closed itself from the inside. In fact, it looked very flimsy. His partner said that he was probably an idiot because the dust here was level 7, if not higher, and the demon that was inside was very dangerous. The young man couldn't stand it and said that he was lying. In fact, a demon of the 7th level or higher appeared on Kanwito Island. It could be. The guy stretched and said that from the very beginning, as soon as he appeared here, his heart began to beat for the first time so that he could hear it. The guy was very happy because he finally had a chance to fight someone very strong. Hanmaru told him that he was a maniac. It was too dangerous for both of them. They should report to Seoul headquarters, in his opinion, and he sent him to find the phone. He went to the door that was on the street. He tried to open it, but the door did not open. The young man did not understand what had happened. He tried to open the door several times by pressing the handle, but the door did not open. Kanmaru thought that something was wrong here, and at this rate he would not be able to leave through the main entrance of this house. Then the young man turned his head, and then he realized that this was all the work of the demon who was in that room. Hanmaru turned his head and saw that his partner was trying to knock down the door to the room where the demon was naked. But he couldn't do anything. He hit not only his foot, but also his fist against the door. He shouted for the demon to open it. The guy insisted that the recluse who was in this room also fight with him. The young man thought that it was very bad that he had been locked in this house with a demon-possessed psychopath. He thought of only one thing, that he didn't want to be with him for a second. And this demon that was locked in this room is a 7th level hikikomori demon. He didn't know what to do with it. The young man was very angry with himself and thought that his affairs were at an all-time low. Dima, who was inside and who was emitting thick yellow dust, began to repeat what the young man had said. His only last word was recluse, and he repeated it several times. When he said the word recluse again, he tried to turn his head to one side. It seemed like he wanted to break out, but he still kept repeating the word recluse for janitor. The guy who was standing near the door looked at his hands, which were wearing gloves, and did not understand what had happened. All his fingers were broken, but there was not a scratch on the door. He wanted to understand only one thing. What was this door made of? That he couldn't break it down in any way. At this time, Hanmaru did not lose it. He found a chair and tried to hit the glass in the window with this chair to break it and get out. After the first blow, nothing happened. He tried to make a few more blows, but the glass did not break. At that moment, the young man thought that the door, the wall, and even the glass windows were so strong that it was unbearable to break through them. Now it was necessary to understand whether that demon recluse could lock them in this house and why he did it. Hanmaru felt that he was about to have another panic attack. He leaned against the wall and almost fell from the wild pain in his chest. All he could think about was that he had been locked in here for an hour and was about to have a panic attack. The guys who were in the office should have been worried about them too. The young man sat in this state for about 2 hours. He did not understand whether they had forgotten about them. He became very angry. At the very time, there was a lot of shouting and fuss at the headquarters of the Rapid Response Department. The head of the headquarters shouted at his employees for not carrying out their orders properly and slammed his fist on the table. His assistant and agent tried to pretend that she was working hard and would solve all the issues. He yelled at her how she could forget about the date of the trip to training in Busan. The girl did not know what to answer him. After a few seconds, she said that the materials were already ready. The captain turned to her and asked what was wrong with that file. Everyone was asking each other some questions after intense work. The agent said that they had already finished, everything was ready. The captain raised her hand and was ready to press the button to send the file. Then they waited for a few minutes for an answer, because they did everything at the last moment, and they were worried that they didn't have time. The captain rose from her seat and shouted to the head of headquarters that the files were all in order. After which the head of the headquarters thanked everyone, and then added that they would see tomorrow morning. He quickly disappeared from the office. The agent sat down on the sofa and exhaled. It seemed to her that she had worked very hard and was very tired. She told her husband that they would leave their morning work and go have some coffee. They didn't go out for coffee right after that. They didn't want to work at all that day. They thought that there was finally some peace in their office. Unexpectedly for everyone, they looked at each other and realized that 2 were missing. They needed to figure out what happened to those 2 because they had been gone for almost 3 hours. The agent grabbed her head and then thought about it and said that she knew that she shouldn't have sent those 2 newbies there. She grabbed her jacket and told Agent Namya Seok to go with her and the other agents to wait for them in the office. The captain didn't agree with her, and she said that she would go too because she felt that something was wrong there. The agent and the captain could not share the laurels of primacy between themselves. Each of them wanted to show that she was stronger. The agent asked the captain if she was sure, since the scene of the incident was very close to their office. The captain replied that they were not worried because she was ready to go with them. In a very short time, they were near the very house where the two newcomers had entered. At first, when they entered the yard and then entered the house, they looked around and did not understand where these two newcomers had gone. One of the agents looked to the side and saw two silhouettes hiding behind the thick yellow dust. It was two newbies running who were trying to shout at them not to close the door, but the door was practically already closed. When the newbies saw what happened, they were very upset and started yelling at the agent and the captain why they went inside. The agent saw the two of them and didn't understand what had happened to them during that time. They showed them the door behind which that same demon was located and said that they could not open this door, as well as all the others. The agent asked the young people again if she understood correctly that this monster that is in this room does not come out of it. They did not answer that yes. The captain raised her hand and asked everyone else to step back. She then activated her ability and extended her arm into a fiery sword. So she wanted to cut this door to go inside. She swung to strike. After the first blow, everything around shook, but the door remained undamaged and did not open. When the captain stepped back, they all saw that the door was not damaged in any way. One of the agents even opened his mouth and said that what he had just seen was very impressive. The agent who brought them to court said that, oh my God, she should try a shower, and asked everyone else to step back. She lifted the sleeve of her jacket and the rest of her things so that a round black spot appeared on her arm. This black spot had small legs and it looked like a spider. The girl took this spider off her body and held it in her palms. She wanted to direct it into this room. She activated the ability of the spider demon. The agent raised her hand along with the spider to the very door. She began to praise her spider for his good work and for the fact that he was able to get inside. She said that he was a good boy. But at some point he went back because he couldn't do it because the hole was too small. Han Maru looked at the agent and thought that she was treating the summoned creature like a pet and taking care of it during the day. Most likely she was just sick. The newbie looked at the agent and said that he should stop just standing there and watching so that he could show them what he was capable of. The agent turned and looked at the young man and said that he had no offensive abilities. Kanmaru looked at this agent and added, if he said so, then it turns out that he is simply useless in such a matter. The agent couldn't stand it and began to speak in an offended voice about how Kanmaru could use the ability from the mirror of the howling demon or his power of gluttony or something else. Hanmaru answered the agent that he could hardly see the enemy and that he was too far away for him to activate his power. The agent laughed at that moment because he decided that the young man was also useless. The newbie approached the captain and asked if there was anyone left in the office who could come and save them. The agent replied that the boss had gone to training and wouldn't be back until tomorrow. The agent turned his head and said that there was another agent who could help them. But at that moment they saw that this very agency was standing right in front of them. They all started shouting loudly, "I don't understand when he came to this building." The agent began to explain that he came because no one was returning. He waited a bit and went to look for them. The young man thought that this agent was completely invisible and they didn't even realize when he managed to arrive. The newly arrived agent tried to look and peer through the keyhole. The girl came up and asked Agent Kim if he could sort this out since he was their last hope. Agent Kim, unexpectedly for everyone, first became weak and then lay down on the floor. No one understood what was happening to him. Everyone stood and watched as he lay in front of the door with one hand under his head. It seemed as if he had simply fallen asleep. Hanmaru asked the others, what kind of joke is this? Did he really just come here to sleep? The agent told him that she had no idea because Kim had previously worked mostly in the office, and she had never seen him use his abilities. Two newbies stood and did not understand what to do. They found themselves in a situation from which no one on their team knew the way out. At some point, they didn't realize that all the team members who came to their aid were all absolutely useless. The agent made a few claps to get everyone else's attention. She asked them all to come closer to her and said that they needed to work together and look for another way out, otherwise they would remain in this closed room. One of the newcomers got very angry with her and said that they had no other way. Then this agent, I don't understand his answer. Do they really just need to sit here and die? Another agent said that they need to wait until the boss returns. He won't attack them anyway. They can stay here for a while. Kanmaru was not at all happy with this situation. He was not going to remain in captivity with the monster until tomorrow. None of them came up with any plan. Each looked at the other and thought that someone else could do something. The only one who didn't participate in all these disputes was the commander. She stood aside and thought about something. When Hanmaru saw that she was standing to the side, he thought that this was not natural for her. She had never been so quiet. It seemed very strange to him. The agent put forward a version of why the demon doesn't move at all. He didn't understand how he was going to kill them in that case. At that moment, all the agents heard a very loud sound coming from somewhere in one of the rooms. The commander turned sharply, started running, and shouted that the sound was coming from the main bedroom. Within seconds, she was in that bedroom and she stopped to look. But what was her surprise? She did not understand what happened and who made this sound. The room where the sound just came from was completely empty. There wasn't even any yellow dust. After everyone came to this place, they heard a very loud crack, and they raised their heads up. Imagine their surprise when they realized that the house was shrinking, and they were in a locked box that was starting to shrink. At that moment, the newbie shouted that he now understood what the goal of the demon of the tavern was. The young man looked at them all and watched as this house became smaller. He understood that this monster, which was in a room that they couldn't get into, which didn't let them leave this house. This monster wanted only one thing. He squeezed this house to the size of his room. So he wanted to remain the only owner of this house. He had to shrink this house to the room where he was himself. Therefore, all the other rooms were not needed by Mu, and he gradually began to destroy them. Now it was clear that the monster wanted to remain the only one in this house. He just wanted to crush them. The young man thought, if we don't get rid of this monster, death will crush us all with its walls. The walls were really moving very quickly. They were narrowing right before our eyes. Kanmaru did not understand what to do now and how to act in this situation. Exactly 4 years ago, a family lived in this house and everything was fine. The girl returned to her home and was very happy to see her grandmother Kang Yun. When she came closer, the grandmother could not see her well, but her younger brother was happy that Chana had returned. Of course, when the girl came closer, the grandmother said that she welcomed her granddaughter home. They stood outside for a while and then they decided to go into the house. Her younger brother, when they went to bed, said that it would be great if the three of them could be together, always like you are today. Her younger brother told the girl that she came to them every vacation. The girl agreed with this. Then she lay down and looked at the ceiling, which was right on top of her. On one truth, she saw a drawing. She asked her brother what kind of drawing it was, and whether it would really ruin the walls, because in fact his granny would scold her brother, said no. And then he added that his grandmother praised him when she saw this drawing. The boy actually draws a happy family when all three of them are together. This drawing was in that very room that was shrinking in size. It was barely visible on the wall, but it was there. The room was very slowly getting smaller and smaller. The captain could not agree that now this room would not exist at all, because the best days of her life had passed in this room. She bit her lip to activate her power. She threw the walls and screamed no. Her power activated and her hand began to change shape, and a fiery sword began to appear in her hand. Then she approached one of the walls and tried to strike so as to stop the movement of this wall. Her sword was killed in this wall, and she tried with all her might to hold it so that it would not shrink. To do this, she leaned one foot against the other wall and held the wall that was moving. But the resistance was much greater than her strength, and her sword began to crack. The captain thought that her sword needed to drink more blood. For this, she bit 2 of her fingers. Her sword became much stronger, and she tried to hold this wall with her sword. She didn't have enough strength, and that's why it was obvious that they were starting to shake her. When the agent saw what was happening to her, she shouted to the captain to stop. It was very dangerous. Kanmaru did not wait long. He immediately rushed to help the captain. He understood that she could not do anything alone. He grabbed her and dragged her away from that place so that she would not waste her strength in vain. The tip of her sword couldn't withstand it and broke off. If she had continued to hold this wall, she could have hurt herself. The young man looked at his captain and realized that something was wrong with her. She was very scared. In her eyes was the same picture that was painted on the wall. Tears began to flow. This picture remained on this wall where they once were a very happy family. She, her younger brother, and grandmother. Kanmaru managed to jump away together with the captain. All the other employees of this agency stood and watched them. They were a little scared but glad that the wall stopped. The young man raised his head and felt how he hit the back of his head very hard. The captain was lying on his arm and did not move. The other agents approached her and tried to bring her to her senses. They wanted to know how she was feeling. The young man said that it looked like she passed out because she had lost a lot of blood and needed to recover. The young man thought it was very strange why she was so diligent and did not want to stop. The agent, without raising her head, said that she really is very close to this place. It is her grandmother's house. Kanmaru was very surprised now. It all became clear to him why she behaved like that. In this house she lost her grandmother and younger brother, and because of the monster. She was the only one who survived and received the ability, but she remembered how it all happened. Kanmaru then understood what was going on and why she was behaving like that. The captain lay on the floor without opening her eyes. It was the first time he saw her completely powerless. Another agent came up to the wall and said that he was very happy because he thought that the whole house would collapse at one moment and crush them. He suggested that they somehow get out of this house because the walls could start closing in again at any moment. The agent walked up to the wall and started picking at it with a small stone. She asked everyone else if they knew the saying. Everyone looked at her, turned her head and told them that water wears away even stone. Time passed. It was already evening outside and almost a day had passed since they were locked in this house. The newbie took his knife and started picking at the wall with the knife, trying to make holes in it. He struck one blow after another, saying that this was reducing his sum and when they would be able to break this wall at this rate. Each of them took turns doing this work, but they didn't go far enough. The holes were very minimal. Kanmaru felt that someone hit him. He turned his head and asked what was needed. It was the second newbie. He said that they needed to change. The young man said that he had messed something up and now it was not his turn. When he stood up, he felt that his arms hurt a lot. And even more than that, he joked that he wanted to eat and drink. He took the knife in his hands and went to make a hole, but felt that someone was stopping him. He turned his head and saw that it was the captain. She said that she would do it herself. The young man asked her if she had come to her senses and needed to rest a little more. The girl replied that she was fine. She took a knife, went to the wall, and started making holes. The young man asked her about what he heard, that this was her grandmother's house. She didn't answer him. Then he said that it was very strange that the empty house was so clean. Most likely she looked after this house. The girl answered him ambiguously that she really looked after this house because she was waiting. He only wanted to clarify what. The captain looked at the young man and said that she was waiting for the monster who killed her family. He must definitely return to this house. The young man asked her where she got such confidence that the monster would return. At that moment, she remembered what happened to her on that fateful day, how she was very scared when she saw all this, and about how this monster killed his family and wanted to kill her. She realized that this monster was very different from other monsters. When she saw him in her room, she turned her head and was very scared. He approached her very slowly, his eyes shining with a bright light. She was so scared at that moment that tears were rolling down her eyes and she couldn't move. He stood in front of her and looked at her for a very long time. It seemed that he wanted to tell her something. The captain added that this monster looked intelligent and seemed to have a purpose. It seemed that he was not just killing people like other monsters. She understood that exactly 1 year later, during the demon invasion, her monster would definitely return. The young man asked her that's why she stayed on the Kongwido Island team, even though they are the owner of the 7th level ability. The captain asked the young man if he was disappointed that she only cared about the monster that killed her family. The young man replied that not at all. He also does this not out of a sense of duty, but only because he has no choice. The salary is good. The captain told him that then he would probably go to Seoul headquarters. After all, the salary there was much higher. The young man asked the captain how she knew. The girl replied that she had seen him when she returned briefly that day. He said that he had not yet decided. The captain said that if he goes there, it will be chocolate because and at that moment they were killed. Again, there was a crackling sound and noise. They raised their head up. All the other agents are very strong. They got scared. I don't understand what's going on, and these walls started moving again. The captain said that everything started all over again, and that everyone should go out into the corridor alive. The young man and the captain quickly began to move towards the exit of this room. The young man was very upset because this sound interrupted what the captain wanted to say. He wanted to know what she was going to say next, but he didn't hear it at all. The next morning, yellow dust covered almost everything around the house. When all the agents are at Les's headquarters, they are the first to see if the walls have stopped moving. One of the agents said that the only person they can count on is the head of headquarters, but when he will arrive is unknown. Someone noticed that the boss said he would be back by the start of the working day, but it looks like he left Busan by a different road. Everyone was sitting in one long corridor. Only one agent who had fallen asleep near the door continued to sleep. The young man looked at him and thought that this agent had been sleeping all this time. He actually didn't even wake up. They were trying their best to escape from here, and he was just sleeping. As soon as they all woke up, the walls started moving again. They started to shrink. The young man rushed to the agent who had been sleeping all the time. He said that he needed to be woken up urgently in case he was hurt. When he ran closer and tried to turn him over, he got very scared and screamed. He didn't understand what was wrong with his face. The agent was very pleased and said that he decided that now was the right time. He didn't have time to finish speaking before the door to this room opened, and a very strong, thick yellow fog with dust started to come out. From this room ran out the same monster that was sitting and was not going to move. It was a reclusive monster. All the agents were very surprised by what happened and what ability the agent who was sleeping used at that moment. The agent who woke up said that he brought mold spores through the door for his ability to work. It took a long time, so he didn't use it often. He was the owner of the mold spore demon ability. Everyone started talking about how great he was and that it was a great job, something he should have told them earlier. The young man and the captain said that they were chatting later and that they should now look in a completely different direction, except for this one monster that ran out of this room that was all covered in mold. At the end of the corridor, several more hands appeared, trying to get out of another room. After the hands appeared, 3 more heads appeared, which also crawled out of the room into the corridor. When they turned around, there were already 4 heads, but they were absolutely identical. They only shouted one word for the janitor, but there were a lot of them, and it seemed that there were more and more of them. The young man did not understand what kind of joke this was. In fact, it was no longer a lone hikimori monster. It was already a whole flock, which moved very quickly towards them and tried to start attacking them. The agents did not understand why they had to fight all these 7th-level demons at the same time.